The Cotulla Ranch stretched like a half-forgotten dream across the Texas scrubland, 25,000 acres of dust and promise baking under a merciless sun. Preston Geese stood at the property line, squinting at the horizon where heat rippled the air into wavering mirages. The year was 1950, and the ranch represented everything the NASA engineer valued: self-reliance, problem-solving, and the unspoken understanding that systems, whether mechanical or natural, could be mastered by those willing to study their patterns. "A man can think out here," Preston murmured to himself, calloused hands resting on the fence post. The distant thrum of a propeller plane drew his eyes skyward. Rockets and rangeland, the dual inheritances he would someday pass down, though not in ways he could yet imagine. 200 miles east in Albuquerque, his daughter Jacqueline sat in a high school classroom, 17 and restless, her notebooks filled with dreams that extended far beyond New Mexico's borders. The late afternoon light slanted through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across her desk. Jackie, as everyone called her, was bright, everyone said so. But brightness alone wasn't always enough in 1954. "Miss Gisa," her teacher said, handing back an essay marked with a red A, "excellent work, as always." Jackie smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere. Ted Jorgensen waited outside on his motorcycle, leather jacket gleaming in the sun. He performed in the traveling circus, a daredevil on wheels who seemed to exist in defiance of gravity and good sense. He represented everything her father's methodical engineering world did not: risk, impulse, the seductive pull of a life unplanned. 6 months later, Jackie sat across from her father at the kitchen table of their modest Albuquerque home. The clock on the wall ticked with merciless precision. Outside, the desert wind scattered tumbleweeds across empty lots. "I'm pregnant," she said finally, the words hanging in the air between them. Preston's face remained impassive, the face of a man who calculated thrust-to-weight ratios and orbital mechanics for a living. "And the father? Ted Jorgensen?" "The circus boy." Not a question. Preston removed his glasses, polishing them deliberately with a handkerchief. "And what does he propose to do about this situation?" "We're getting married." A shotgun wedding followed, quiet and perfunctory. Jackie wore a simple dress, not the flowing white gown she'd once imagined. Ted stood beside her, handsome but bewildered, a young man suddenly thrust into responsibilities he hadn't anticipated. Their marriage certificate was signed in May 1962, a document that would bind their names together in county records long after everything else between them dissolved. The Cuban Missile Crisis dominated the headlines that October, but in Miami, another Cuban story was unfolding with less fanfare. Miguel Bezos, 18 and alone, stepped off a plane at Miami International Airport, one of thousands of children evacuated through Operation Pedro Pan. The humid Florida air hit him like a wall after the plane's air conditioning, the first of many adjustments awaiting him in this strange new country. Miguel Mike, as he would soon be called, carried only a small suitcase and the fierce determination that had propelled him out of Castro's Cuba. His English was halting but improving daily. America in 1962 hummed with possibility for young men with technical minds. The space race accelerated. Computers evolved from room-sized calculators to something more powerful, and corporations like Exxon offered clear pathways upward for engineers willing to learn their systems. "Next," called the immigration officer, barely looking up from his desk. Mike stepped forward, papers clutched tightly in hand. "Miguel Bezos," he said clearly, practicing the American inflection he'd been rehearsing on the flight. "I'm here to study." The officer stamped his documents with mechanical efficiency. "Welcome to the United States, son." Back in Texas, Preston Gise's ranch continued its quiet operation. The farmhouse stood solid against prairie storms, its foundation unmoved by the political tremors shaking the world beyond its boundaries. Inside the workshop attached to the barn, Preston maintained a meticulous organization system: tools hanging in precise arrangements on pegboards, repair manuals stacked and categorized, spare parts in labeled drawers. "Engineering isn't just about building new things," he often said to the ranch hands. It's about maintaining what works and fixing what doesn't. This philosophy, repair culture, permeated every corner of the ranch. Nothing was discarded if it could be fixed. Nothing was replaced if it could be improved. When the windmill that pulled water from the deep aquifer began to falter, Preston spent 3 days disassembling and rebuilding it, emerging grease-stained but satisfied. "See this?" he explained to a young ranch hand, pointing to a modified gear assembly. "The manufacturer's design was insufficient for our wind conditions, so we adapt." The world beyond the ranch boundaries was changing rapidly. The Cold War intensified. DARPA funding flowed into research labs. NASA's budget expanded as Kennedy promised the moon. Preston moved between these worlds with ease. The government engineer during the week, the pragmatic rancher on weekends and holidays. Both identities required the same core skills: systems thinking, patient troubleshooting, and the ability to work within constraints. In Albuquerque, Jackie's marriage to Ted Jorgensen was already showing fractures. Ted's circus work kept him traveling. Jackie found herself alone more often than not, navigating pregnancy without a partner's steady presence. Her father called weekly, his questions practical rather than emotional. "Do you have enough money for doctor's visits?" Preston would ask. "Is the apartment warm enough? Have you started preparing for the baby?" Never, "Are you happy? Are you afraid? Do you regret your choices?" Engineers dealt in measurables, not emotions. By late 1962, Mike Bezos had settled into life in America. He worked odd jobs while studying English at night, his accent softening around the edges. The Cuban community in Miami provided structure and support, but Mike's ambitions stretched beyond their insular world. He enrolled in engineering courses at the local community college, his notebooks filled with meticulous diagrams and calculations. "You will go far," his mathematics professor told him after class one evening. "You have the mind for precision and the hunger to succeed." Mike nodded, accepting the compliment with characteristic humility. "In Cuba, I had dreams. In America, I have opportunities." The professor clasped his shoulder. "That's the American story, son." But America's story in the early 1960s was complicated by racial tensions, fear of nuclear annihilation, and shifting social norms. The post-war prosperity that built suburban subdivisions and filled them with appliances coexisted with deeper anxieties about what kind of nation America was becoming. For immigrants like Mike, these contradictions were part of the landscape they navigated daily, the explicit welcome alongside implicit expectations to assimilate, to succeed, to justify their presence. In early 1963, Jackie Jorgensen faced the reality that her marriage was ending. Ted's returns home grew more infrequent, his phone calls shorter and less engaged. She moved back to her parents' home temporarily, her pregnancy advancing as her marriage receded. "He's not coming back, is he?" her mother asked quietly one evening. Jackie shook her head, hands resting on her swollen abdomen. "No, I don't think so." "Your father will help you figure out what comes next," her mother assured her. "We always do." This was the Gisè way facing problems directly, formulating solutions, implementing them without excessive emotion. The engineering approach applied to personal crises as well as mechanical ones. Preston made calls, researched options, and created contingency plans. Unwed motherhood in 1963 America carried social penalties that could limit his daughter's future prospects. Adoption was discussed briefly, then discarded. This would be a Gisè grandchild, regardless of circumstances. "We adapt," Preston said simply, echoing his workshop philosophy. "We redesign the system to accommodate new variables." On the Catula Ranch, summer heat baked the earth hard as concrete. Cicadas droned in mesquite trees, cattle sought shade wherever they could find it. Preston worked methodically through his DARPA paperwork at the kitchen table, the ranch's diesel generator humming in the background. The radio murmured news about civil rights demonstrations in Alabama and Soviet missile deployments. "The world's getting complicated, Eleanor," he said to his wife as she brought him iced tea. "The world's always been complicated," she replied practically. "We just hear about more of it now." Preston nodded. turning back to his engineering diagrams. Eleanor was right, as usual. Systems were systems, whether mechanical, political, or familial. Each had inputs and outputs, feedback loops and failure points. The engineer's job wasn't to eliminate complexity, but to design robust processes that could withstand it. Meanwhile, Mike Bezos continued his American education. By mid-1963, his English had improved dramatically, and his engineering coursework showed promise. Exxon had begun recruiting at his school, looking for bright minds who understood both technical systems and practical applications. The petroleum industry represented stability and upward mobility, a corporate ladder with clearly defined rungs. "You should apply," his advisor encouraged. "They're especially interested in bilingual candidates who can work in their Latin American operations." Mike considered this carefully. "I came to America to be American," he said finally, "but perhaps my background could be an asset rather than something to overcome." This insight, that difference could create value rather than obstacles, represented a subtle shift in his thinking about his place in his adopted country. In the final months of 1963, these separate storylines, Preston's ranch philosophy, Jackie's failed marriage, and Mike's immigrant journey, remained distinct threads in a pattern not yet woven together. Their convergence still lay ahead, dependent on chance meetings and deliberate choices that would shape a family's trajectory. Preston Geese stood at his ranch's boundary fence one evening, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. The property represented more than land to him. It was a proving ground for self-reliance, a classroom for learning how systems functioned in the real world. Someday, he thought, these lessons would matter to his grandchild, though he couldn't yet know how profoundly. Miles away, Jackie prepared for single motherhood with characteristic Geese determination, researching childcare options, budgeting meticulously, creating contingency plans for various scenarios. The pregnancy that had begun as an interruption of her planned life now represented a future she was determined to secure. And in Miami, Mike Bezos drafted applications for engineering positions, his careful handwriting filling page after page. America in late 1963 still pulsed with post-war optimism despite deepening Cold War tensions. For a young Cuban immigrant with technical skills and unflagging work ethic, doors were opening slowly but perceptibly. These three lives, a NASA engineer with a Texas ranch, his pregnant daughter navigating a failed marriage, and a Cuban refugee pursuing an engineering career, moved along separate orbits that year. Their eventual convergence would create the gravitational conditions from which an empire would someday rise. But that remained unknown to them, hidden in the future's uncertainty. What they shared, without knowing it, was a fundamental approach to the world, the belief that systems could be understood, that problems yielded to patient analysis. That adaptation was not just possible, but necessary. This inheritance, more valuable than land or money, would eventually flow to a child not yet born, shaping his understanding of what was possible when determination met opportunity. As 1963 drew to a close, Preston Geese made notes in his workshop journal, documenting improvements to the ranch's water system. Jackie sorted baby clothes in her parents' spare bedroom. Mike Bezos received his first interview request from Exxon, the letter arriving in a crisp business envelope. The foundations were being laid, invisible but essential. The legacy taking shape wasn't measured in wealth but in mindset. The engineer's precision, the rancher's self-reliance, the immigrant's hunger for reinvention. These qualities would someday merge in a grandson Preston had not yet met, whose empire would arise not from inherited privilege, but from these inherited attitudes. The conviction that complex systems yield to patient, empirical pressure, and the confidence that anything broken can be fixed with the right tools and temperament. The Texas night deepened. Stars emerged over the Catala Ranch, the same stars that shone on Miami where Mike Bezos studied late into the night, the same stars that Jackie Gise contemplated from her window. Hand resting on her abdomen where a future neither could imagine was already taking shape. The soft orange glow of New Mexico's setting sun painted long shadows across Albuquerque Memorial Hospital, on the evening of January 12, 1964. Outside, the world was changing. President Johnson's Great Society speeches on the radio, Beatles records spinning on turntables across America, and the distant thunder of Vietnam escalating. Inside, in a sterile delivery room, Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen took his first breath. Jacqueline, just 17, cradled her newborn son while her teenage husband, Ted Jorgensen, paced nervously in the waiting room. The young couple's faces bore the strain of circumstances they weren't prepared for, their youth evident in every anxious glance, every uncertain touch of their newborn. "He's caught your eyes," the nurse said to Jacqueline, who managed a tired smile. The baby's first home was a modest apartment near Route 66, where neon motel signs flickered through thin curtains and the constant hum of passing traffic served as a lullaby. Ted worked at a local bike shop, his hands perpetually stained with grease as he tried to provide. But the foundations were shaky from the start. "I don't know if I can do this," Ted confessed late one night, his voice barely audible over the window unit air conditioner. Outside, a Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop, its headlights briefly illuminating their cramped living room. "We have to," Jacqueline whispered, young Jeffrey asleep against her shoulder. But the resignation in her voice betrayed what both knew. The marriage was dissolving faster than the aspirin tablets Ted dropped into water after long days at the shop. By 1968, Jacqueline had made the difficult choice to start over. She met Miguel Mike Bezos, a Cuban immigrant working his way through the University of Albuquerque, whose gentle demeanor and quiet ambition offered a stability Ted couldn't provide. Miguel fell in love not only with Jacqueline but with 4-year-old Jeffrey as well. The adoption papers were signed in a county clerk's office with peeling linoleum floors and the pervasive smell of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink. Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen became Jeffrey Preston Bezos that day, while somewhere across town, Ted Jorgensen continued fixing bicycles, gradually fading from his son's life like a photograph left too long in the sun. "Do you understand what's happening today, Jeff?" Miguel asked, kneeling to the boy's level outside the government building. The child nodded, his serious eyes taking in his new father's face. "You're my daddy now." Miguel's throat tightened. "Yes, and I always will be." Their new life took them toward Houston, where the space program was transforming the city into a hub of technical innovation. The Bezos family settled into a modest home with neat hedges and a carport. Mike, now working for Exxon, brought home the stability of an engineer's salary, along with stories of systems, processes, and efficiency that fascinated young Jeff. River Oaks Elementary accepted Jeff into their gifted program in 1970, a program born of America's post-Sputnik anxiety and hunger for technical excellence. The school hallways smelled of floor wax and chalk dust, while the classrooms hummed with the energy of accelerated learning. For Jeff, it was like finding water in a desert. "He's different from the other children," his teacher explained to Mike and Jackie during a parent-teacher conference, fluorescent lights humming overhead. "The way he approaches problems, he's systematic. Methodical," Jackie smiled, unsurprised. "He takes apart everything in the house. Clocks, radios. He wants to know how they work." But it was the school's early access to computing that truly captured Jeff's imagination. In an era when most children had never seen a computer, River Oaks had arranged limited access to mainframe computing via time-sharing terminals. The beige IBM cabinets with their punched cards and teletype interfaces were like portals to another dimension for young Jeff. The first time he heard the whir of the cooling fans and saw green text materialize on the black screen, he stood transfixed, unaware that his future was being written in that moment. The machine responded to his commands, simple ones at first, then increasingly complex as he mastered its language. 10 more minutes, Jeffrey," the lab supervisor would say, checking her watch. "Just one more program," he'd plead, fingers never leaving the keyboard. Summer breaks took Jeff away from the computing lab to his grandfather's ranch near Cotulla, Texas. Preston Geese, a former NASA engineer with calloused hands and precise speech, became Jeff's guide to a different kind of system, the self-sufficient ecosystem of ranch life. The summer of 1971 found Jeff standing beside his grandfather in the pre-dawn chill. the Texas sky still scattered with stars. The ranch stretched around them, 25,000 acres of responsibility. "Fence is down in the south pasture," Preston said, handing Jeff a canteen of water. "Let's see if you remember how to fix it." The day unfolded in a sequence of practical lessons. When their truck broke down miles from the ranch house, Preston didn't immediately jump to solutions. "What do you think happened?" he asked Jeff instead. The boy circled the vehicle, considering. "The engine's making that clicking sound again, like last time when the battery connection was loose." Preston nodded, pleased. "So, what should we check first?" This was the Raj methodology: diagnosis before action, understanding before intervention. Jeff learned to repair windmills, mend fences, and deliver calves with the same careful attention he gave to programming back in Houston. "Out here," Preston often said, wiping sweat from his weathered face, "you can't call for help. You have to figure it out yourself." At night, after dinner at the long wooden table, Jeff would often sit on the porch with his grandfather, listening to the radio news about the Apollo program, Vietnam casualty counts, Nixon's latest speech, while Preston taught him to read the stars. "Navigation," Preston explained, pointing upward, "is knowing where you are and where you're going. Everything else is just details." Back in Houston for the school year, Jeff began to synthesize these dual educations: the digital precision of the computer lab and the rugged pragmatism of the ranch. He started a notebook of ideas, writing in careful block letters, creating systems for everything from his paper route to organizing his growing collection of science fiction books. His room became a workshop where half-disassembled appliances shared space with dog-eared Isaac Asimov paperbacks and carefully drawn schematics. Jackie would find him asleep at his desk, pencil still in hand, waking him gently to guide him to bed. "What were you working on so late?" she asked one morning over breakfast, the kitchen filled with the scent of coffee and toast. Jeff's eyes brightened. "I figured out how to make an automatic door opener for the garage using pulleys and an alarm clock timer." Mike exchanged glances with Jackie. "Sounds complicated." "Not really," Jeff said, already drawing the system on a paper napkin. "It's just about understanding the parts and how they work together." The Bezos household ran on a mixture of immigrant frugality and practical innovation. Mike had brought from Cuba a deep appreciation for opportunity and an aversion to waste. Nothing was thrown away if it could be repaired or repurposed. One rainy Saturday in 1972, Mike called Jeff to the garage where he was changing the oil in their Oldsmobile. "Watch carefully," Mike said, guiding Jeff's hands to the filter wrench. "Cars are expensive, but maintenance is cheap." Jeff nodded, absorbing not just the mechanical lesson but the philosophy behind it: prevention over cure, systems over symptoms, long-term thinking over short-term convenience. This approach extended to the family budget as well. Jackie kept meticulous records of household expenses in a ledger on the kitchen counter, showing Jeff how to track incoming and outgoing resources. An early lesson in cash flow management. "We don't buy what we can't afford," she explained while balancing the checkbook one evening, the television murmuring in the background with reports of the Watergate break-in. "And we save for what matters." By the end of 1972, 8-year-old Jeff had developed a peculiar fusion of influences: the ranch's self-reliance, his adoptive father's immigrant practicality, his mother's methodical organization, and the computational thinking from his school's early computer lab. He moved between these worlds with increasing confidence, applying lessons from one domain to problems in another. On his 8th birthday, his parents gave him a telescope, a recognition of his dual fascination with space and systems. That night, from their backyard, Jeff pointed it toward the moon, where the last Apollo mission had recently landed. "Do you think I'll go there someday?" he asked his father. Mike placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The moon, maybe, but I think you'll go places no one has imagined yet." Jeff smiled, adjusting the focus. In the eyepiece, the lunar surface came sharply into view, craters, plains, and possibilities. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought was forming about frontiers and what lay beyond them. Inside, on his desk, next to a disassembled transistor radio and a carefully hand-labeled star chart, lay his notebook of ideas. On the last page he had written a simple question: How do systems grow? He didn't have the answer yet, but something in him already understood that the question itself was what mattered, that asking the right questions was often more powerful than having ready answers. It was a philosophy born in the dust of a Texas ranch and the hum of a school computer lab, one that would guide him through decades yet to come. In the quiet of his room, surrounded by books about space exploration and circuit diagrams, the foundation was being laid for a future no one, perhaps not even Jeff himself, could have predicted. For now, he was simply a curious boy with a telescope, gazing up at the stars from a Houston backyard, asking questions about how things worked and why. The Miami sun was merciless, pressing down through the windows of Palmetto Senior High School like a physical weight. Jeffrey Bezos, 15 years old and rail-thin, sat in the back of his mathematics class, the teacher's voice fading into the background as numbers danced across his notebook. Not the assigned problems, those had been completed 20 minutes ago, but calculations of his own design, projections of profit margins and enrollment capacities. The bell rang and students rushed from their desks, but Jeff lingered, adding one final column of figures before closing his notebook. Miami in 1976 was a city in transition, a kaleidoscope of retirees seeking warmth, Cuban refugees building new lives, and the first whispers of the cocaine trade that would define the next decade. But for Jeff, recently transplanted from Albuquerque after his stepfather Mike's transfer with Exxon, it was simply home now, a place of possibility. Bezos called Mr. Hartman, the mathematics teacher, as Jeff passed his desk. Your solution to the extra credit problem was unorthodox. Jeff paused, clutching his textbooks to his chest. But correct? The older man's lips twitched. Correct, yes, but most students would have used the standard formula. The standard formula required 17 steps. Mine took 8. Jeff's voice was soft but matter-of-fact without bravado. Efficiency matters, sir. Hartman studied him for a moment, then nodded. Indeed it does. You might consider the Math Olympiad next semester. Outside in the hallway, the familiar cacophony of slamming lockers and overlapping conversations washed over him. Jeff moved with purpose through the crowd, mentally reviewing his schedule. School until 3, McDonald's shift from 4 to 8, 2 hours of reading before bed. The routine was precise, a self-imposed discipline that felt not like a burden but a framework, a scaffolding upon which he could build. The McDonald's on Dixie Highway was a temple of efficiency, a place where seconds mattered and procedures were gospel. Jeff stood at the grill, sweat beading on his forehead as he monitored the precise cooking times of the thin beef patties. 2 minutes, then flip. The heat lamps cast everything in a yellowish glow, the sizzle of meat and hiss of the fryer later creating a mechanical symphony. Order up, 4 Big Macs, 3 regular, 1 no pickle. Jeff moved with practiced precision, assembling the sandwiches according to the laminated procedure card mounted above his station. Special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. A formula as strict and unyielding as any mathematical equation. Each component had to be placed just so, the process repeated identically thousands of times per shift. Bezos, you're too slow, barked the shift manager, a perpetually harried man with thinning hair and permanent ketchup stains on his polyester uniform. We've got a line out the door. Jeff didn't look up, didn't break rhythm. Rushing creates waste. 3 more seconds per burger means 0 returns, net time savings of 12 seconds per order. The manager started to object, then stopped, watching as Jeff completed the order in precisely the time he'd calculated. It wasn't the first time the teenager had analyzed the workflows, seeking inefficiencies, optimizing processes. Most 16-year-olds complained about the monotony. Jeff seemed to find it fascinating, like a complex puzzle to be solved. Later, as he cleaned the grill at closing time, Jeff's mind wandered to his plans for summer. The Dream Institute. His educational summer camp needed refinement. Last year had been a modest success, a small profit of $200 from 6 students. But scaling would be the challenge. More students meant more complex logistics, more variables, more potential failure points. You heading to college after graduation, Bezos? Asked Carlos, a fellow cook who was mopping the floor nearby. Jeff's hands continued their methodical movement, scrubbing the carbonized residue from the grill's surface. Princeton, if I can get in. Computer science. Computer science? What's that going to do for you? Jeff smiled slightly. Everything is going to be computers, Carlos. Everything. The older boy shrugged, resuming his mopping. If you say so. I'm sticking with what I know. My uncle's got a body shop, says he'll take me on full time. The conversation faded as Jeff mentally returned to his Dream Institute plans. 6 students had been manageable for one instructor himself. 12 would require better systems, perhaps an assistant. The tuition would need to increase from $200 to $250 per student to accommodate the expansion while maintaining profit margins. He'd need to develop standardized materials rather than the custom approach he'd used before. Scaling was hard. That was the lesson from last summer. Growth created complexity, and complexity bred failure unless properly managed. It was a puzzle worth solving. The Bezos family home in Miami was modest but comfortable, a ranch-style house with a small yard and a carport where Mike parked his Ford Pinto, a car the family joked might spontaneously combust at any moment, given its notorious design flaws. Inside, the house was neat, orderly, with bookshelves dominating the living room walls. Jeff sat at the dining table, surrounded by brochures and handwritten notes, finalizing plans for the Dream Institute's second summer session. His mother, Jackie, placed a glass of iced tea beside him, peering over his shoulder at the papers. "You've put a lot of thought into this," she said, pride evident in her voice. Jeff nodded, taking a sip of the tea. "I've identified the bottlenecks from last year. 6 students was too few for optimal economics, but manageable for one instructor. 12 is the sweet spot for profitability versus quality, but requires more structured programming." Jackie smiled, sitting down across from him. Most teenagers would be planning how to spend their summer at the beach, not creating educational programs. "The beach doesn't pay $2.30 an hour, Jeff replied, a rare hint of humor in his voice. "And neither does McDonald's, for all the hours you spend there thinking about how to improve their systems," she countered. Jeff looked up, his expression earnest. "It's not about McDonald's. It's about understanding how things work, how to make them better. The processes, the systems, they're fascinating. Everything breaks down when you try to scale if you don't have the right framework." Jackie studied her son, this serious young man who had always been different, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always questioning, analyzing. "Your stepfather and I were talking," she said carefully. "If you need a small loan for startup costs for your summer program, we could help." Jeff shook his head immediately. "Thank you, but no. The Dream Institute needs to stand on its own economically, or the model is flawed." He paused, then added, "I've calculated that with pre-enrollment payments, I can cover the initial materials. It's cash flow positive from day one if I'm careful." "You're 17, Jeff. It's okay to accept help sometimes." He smiled at her, his eyes soft with affection but his resolve unchanged. "I know, but this is something I need to figure out myself." Later that night, in the quiet of his bedroom, Jeff lay on his bed reading Foundation by Isaac Asimov, one of his favorite science fiction novels. With its sweeping vision of psychohistory and the mathematical prediction of future events. Beside him was a stack of other books, business histories, science fiction, and a dog-eared copy of The Magic of Thinking Big that his stepfather had given him. The digital clock on his nightstand read 11:42 p.m., but sleep was still far from his mind. In a notebook, he'd begun sketching out a curriculum for the Dream Institute, logical problem solving, basic computer programming concepts, mathematical puzzles designed to challenge young minds. The program would be rigorous but engaging, demanding but rewarding. High standards were non-negotiable. Jeff flipped to a fresh page and began writing a list of potential improvements. Structured daily schedule, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Pre-prepared materials reduce prep time. Standard evaluation metrics for student progress. Parent feedback forms for quality control. Student-to-instructor ratio capped at 6:1. The challenge wasn't just teaching. It was creating a system that could deliver consistent quality at scale. That was the key insight from his McDonald's experience. When the restaurant was busy, quality suffered unless systems were in place to maintain standards regardless of volume. The same principle would apply to his summer camp. As midnight approached, Jeff closed his notebook and picked up Asimov again, losing himself in visions of future civilizations and the mathematical patterns that governed them. In the quiet night, with Miami's humid air pressing through the window screen, he felt a sense of alignment between the structured worlds of science fiction, the practical lessons of his McDonald's job, and his own budding entrepreneurial experiments. Summer 1978 arrived in a wave of heat and humidity. The Dream Institute's second year began with 12 students, ages 10 to 13, gathered in a rented classroom at the local community center. Jeff had expanded beyond his original focus on mathematics to include basic computer concepts, using a borrowed Commodore PET when he could secure it. Computers think in binary, he explained to the circle of attentive faces. Just zeros and ones. Everything, every word, every picture, every calculation can be broken down into these simple components. A small boy with glasses raised his hand. But how does it know what to do with the zeros and ones? Excellent question, Jeff replied, his usual seriousness giving way to enthusiasm. That's where programming comes in. We give the computer instructions, algorithms, that tell it how to interpret these patterns. The session continued, Jeff moving methodically through his prepared materials. He'd refined his approach based on last year's experience, creating a more structured curriculum with clear learning objectives for each day. The students responded well to his serious demeanor. He wasn't trying to be their friend, but their guide to a world of logical thinking and problem-solving. During the lunch break, Jeff sat alone, reviewing notes and adjusting the afternoon plans. The community center's air conditioning struggled against the Miami heat, the room cool but not comfortable. He'd calculated the economics carefully. $250 per student for the 2-week program, $3,000 gross revenue. Expenses included $600 for room rental, $400 for materials, and a $300 stipend for Martin, a college student he'd hired to assist with the larger group. The projected profit was $1,700, not life-changing, but a 130% increase from last year. Your kids are really engaged, said Martin, dropping into the chair across from him. Most summer programs I've worked, they're just waiting for the day to end so they can hit the pool. Jeff nodded, making a note in his binder. Curiosity is natural. Most educational environments just fail to channel it properly. How'd you come up with all this curriculum? It's pretty advanced stuff for middle schoolers. Jeff looked up, his expression thoughtful. I read a lot. Science fiction gives you the big ideas, the long-term perspective. Business histories teach you how systems succeed or fail. I combined them. Martin laughed. Man, when I was their age, I was just trying to beat Space Invaders at the arcade. Video games are algorithms too, Jeff replied. Pattern recognition, procedural thinking, optimization problems. They're learning the same skills, just with different applications. The afternoon session focused on practical problem solving, how to break complex challenges into manageable components, how to test solutions methodically, how to learn from failure rather than fear it. Jeff moved among the students, offering guidance but never simply providing answers. The process, the thinking, was what mattered. As the day ended and parents arrived to collect their children, Jeff observed the interactions carefully. Most of the students were excited, eagerly sharing what they'd learned. 2 seemed disengaged, potential retention risks. He made notes for follow-up strategies to re-engage them tomorrow. Mr. Bezos, a mother approached, her son, the boy with glasses from the morning session in tow. I just wanted to say how impressed we are with the program. Timothy hasn't stopped talking about algorithms since he came home yesterday. Jeff nodded politely. Timothy asks excellent questions. He has a natural aptitude for systems thinking. The compliment was specific, factual, not empty praise. The boy beamed, And Jeff made another mental note. Recognition of specific strengths was a powerful motivator, more effective than general encouragement. After the last student had departed, Jeff and Martin cleaned the classroom and prepared materials for the next day. The process was efficient, each task allocated to maximize productivity. "You ever think about doing this full-time?" Martin asked as they finished. "You know, after college, starting a real school or something." Jeff paused, considering the question. "No, this is a laboratory, not a destination." "A laboratory? For what?" "For understanding how systems scale, how to deliver consistent quality, how to create frameworks that can grow without breaking." Jeff closed his binder with a decisive motion. "The content is secondary to the process." Martin shook his head, smiling. "You're an interesting guy, Bezos." Palmetto Senior High's library was Jeff's sanctuary during lunch periods. While other seniors gathered in the cafeteria or courtyard, he could often be found at a corner table, a sandwich in one hand and a book in the other. Today it was The Soul of a New Machine, Tracy Kidder's Chronicle of Computer Engineering at Data General. "There you are," said Michael, one of the few other students Jeff considered a friend, sliding into the chair across from him. "You missed it." Karen Thomas agreed to be Craig's prom date. Whole cafeteria witnessed the ask. Jeff looked up briefly. "That's statistically improbable. She's rejected 7 previous invitations according to Melissa's tracking." Michael laughed. "Not everything is about statistics, man. Sometimes it's about timing, chemistry." He paused, noting Jeff's raised eyebrow. "Okay, fine, maybe it's statistics too." "What are you reading now?" Jeff tilted the book so Michael could see the cover. "It's about a team building a next-generation computer under impossible deadlines. The psychology is fascinating. How they manage complexity, how leadership works under pressure." "Sounds thrilling," Michael replied with good-natured sarcasm. "Speaking of thrilling, there's a party at Scott's beach house this weekend. His parents are in the Keys until Sunday." Jeff returned to his book. "I have McDonald's Saturday night and Dream Institute prep on Sunday." You know, normal 18-year-olds occasionally do things that are fun, not just productive. Jeff looked up again, his expression not defensive but genuinely curious. "Who defines normal and who defines fun?" Michael sighed dramatically. Philosophical Jeff has entered the chat. "Look, I'm just saying maybe take a break sometimes. The McDonald's job, the summer camp thing, the constant reading, when do you just relax?" "This is relaxing," Jeff replied, gesturing to the book. "And the Dream Institute isn't an obligation, it's an experiment. Each iteration teaches me something new about operational constraints, about how to design systems that can handle growth." Michael shook his head, but there was affection in the gesture. "You're going to be running something big someday, Bezos. Just don't forget to live a little along the way." As Michael left, Jeff returned to his book, but his friend's words lingered. It wasn't that he didn't understand the appeal of parties, of social connections, of the typical high school experience. He simply calculated value differently, weighted variables in a way that often put him on a separate path from his peers. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Jeff gathered his things methodically, marking his place in the book with a precise bookmark. Princeton's acceptance letter had arrived last month, computer science and electrical engineering, as he'd planned. The path was clear, the trajectory calculated. Each experience now, McDonald's, the Dream Institute, his voracious reading was building a foundation, creating a toolkit that would serve purposes not yet fully defined, but intuitively understood. The graduation party at the Bezos home was modest but warm, with a small gathering of family friends and a handful of Jeff's classmates from Palmetto Senior High. Mike manned the grill in the backyard, the scent of charcoal and hamburgers mingling with the sweet fragrance of Jackie's homemade key lime pie cooling on the kitchen counter. Jeff, uncomfortable as the center of attention, had retreated to a quiet corner of the patio with his grandfather Preston, who had flown in from Texas for the occasion. The older man, weather-beaten from decades of ranch work and engineering projects, studied his grandson with quiet pride. "Princeton," Preston said, nodding slowly. Good choice. Rigorous. Technical. Jeff nodded. Their computer science program is among the best, and the opportunities afterward. You're thinking beyond the degree already, Preston observed. Good. Education is a means, not an end. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the small gathering. Jeff's mother laughed at something the Mavis said, her face animated. Mike flipped burgers with mechanical precision, a skill honed through years of Sunday barbecues. The scene was ordinary, domestic, a million miles from the complex systems and grand visions that occupied Jeff's thoughts. Your McDonald's manager called, Preston said after a while. Wanted to know if you'd consider staying on, working toward assistant manager. Said you've redesigned half their processes already. Jeff smiled slightly. The job served its purpose. I learned what I needed to learn. And what was that? That process discipline matters more than individual talent. Systems designed for normal conditions break under pressure unless you've built in the right buffers. That customer experience is a function of operational excellence, not just good intentions. Jeff paused, then added, and that scaling breaks things in ways you can't anticipate unless you've stress-tested the fundamentals. Preston nodded, unsurprised by the analytical response. The Dream Institute taught you that last part, I suspect? Yes. 12 students required different systems than 6. If I'd tried to handle 20, the whole thing would have collapsed without structural changes. Jeff's voice grew more animated. It's fascinating, really. There are mathematical relationships between scale and complexity that most businesses don't account for. Preston laughed softly. Most 18-year-olds wouldn't find that fascinating. Most 18-year-olds haven't read enough business histories, Jeff replied, then caught the humor in his grandfather's eyes and smiled in acknowledgement of his own seriousness. Across the yard, Michael arrived with a small gift wrapped in newspaper comics, a deliberate choice. Jeff knew that reflected both Michael's perpetual lack of proper wrapping paper and his sense of humor. Your friend's here, Preston observed. I'll leave you to it. Just remember, Jeffrey. I know, Jeff interrupted gently. The systems are tools, not the purpose. People matter most. Preston nodded, patting his grandson's shoulder before rising to join Mike at the grill. Jeff watched him go, aware of the legacy of practicality and principles the older man had passed down. From the ranch in Kotula to the engineering projects with NASA, Preston had demonstrated that technical mastery and human values weren't opposed but interconnected. Michael dropped into the chair Preston had vacated, handing over the comic-wrapped package. Here, something to remember the plebeians by when you're off with the Princeton elite. Jeff carefully unwrapped it, revealing a paperback copy of Dune by Frank Herbert, a science fiction classic they'd discussed, but Jeff hadn't yet read. It's about long-term thinking, systems within systems, and seeing patterns others miss, Michael explained. Figured it was on brand for you. Jeff turned the book over, examining it with genuine appreciation. Thank you. This is perfect. Yeah, well, I figured you'd have the rest of your life to read business manuals and computer code. A little space opera couldn't hurt. Michael glanced around at the small gathering. So, this is it, huh? No wild graduation rager for the Bezos household. Jeff's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Would you expect anything else? Nope, completely on brand, as I said. Michael leaned back in his chair. So Princeton in the fall, the Ivy League, the next step in the grand Bezos master plan. There's no master plan, Michael. Sure there is. Maybe not written down, but it's in that brain of yours. Always has been. The McDonald's job, the dream thing, they weren't just ways to make money. They were laboratories, like you always say. Jeff studied his friend thoughtfully. He'd been paying more attention than I realized. Michael shrugged. Hey, just because I don't read business histories for fun doesn't mean I can't recognize a pattern. He paused, then added more seriously. Whatever you end up doing, it's going to be interesting. And probably a little intimidating. Why intimidating? Because you don't just want to succeed, Jeff. You want to redesign the game. Michael grinned. Also, you're weirdly obsessed with efficiency, which is slightly terrifying. Jeff laughed, a genuine sound that drew glances from the adults nearby, unaccustomed to such unguarded moments from the serious teenager. Efficiency is just eliminating waste, There's nothing terrifying about it. Uh-huh. Tell that to the McDonald's staff who now have to follow your optimized burger flipping protocol. The conversation drifted to other topics. Plans for the summer, Princeton preparations, mutual friends heading to other colleges. The Miami evenings settled around them, warm and humid, the sky fading from blue to purple as dusk approached. Later, as the party wound down and guests departed, Jeff helped his mother clean up the kitchen, wrapping leftover food with precise movements and methodically loading the dishwasher. "You had fun today," Jackie observed. Not a question, but a statement. Jeff nodded. "It was a good gathering, properly sized for meaningful interaction." Jackie laughed, shaking her head. "Only you would evaluate a party on its operational efficiency." He smiled, acknowledging the gentle teasing. "The key lime pie was excellent, your best batch yet. I followed the recipe exactly. You always do, that's why it works." Jeff paused, then added, "Thank you for everything." Jackie's expression softened. She reached out and brushed a lock of dark hair from his forehead, a maternal gesture unchanged since his childhood. "We're so proud of you, Jeff. Not just for Princeton, but for who you are." He nodded, accepting the praise without deflection. In the quiet kitchen, with the sounds of Mike talking to Preston in the living room filtering in, Jeff felt a moment of perfect alignment between past and future, between the structured systems he valued and the human connections that gave them meaning. Tomorrow, he would return to his preparations for Princeton, his reading list, his methodical planning for the next phase. But tonight, in this moment, there was just the satisfaction of completion, of one chapter closing properly before the next began. Outside, the Miami night deepened, stars appearing in the humid sky. Inside, the foundations laid in these formative years, the process discipline from McDonald's, the scaling lessons from the Dream Institute, the systems thinking from countless books, settled into place, building blocks for what would come. The autumn light slanted through the leaded glass windows of the Gothic library, casting long shadows across the oak tables where Jeff Bezos hunched over a stack of computer science journals. Princeton in 1982 was a place of contradictions, medieval architecture housing cutting-edge computational theory, ancient traditions mingling with the electric future promised by Reagan's America. "You're going to burn a hole in that paper," said Martin, his study partner, nodding at the intensity with which Jeff was underlining passages about computational complexity theory. Jeff looked up, his already receding hairline catching the amber light. "I'm just trying to see the pattern," he said, his voice quiet but precise. "There's always a pattern." Outside, the campus court hummed with the particular energy of an Ivy League afternoon. Frisbees cut lazy arcs between neo-Gothic spires, while students in cable-knit sweaters debated supply-side economics and the Cold War's latest chess moves. But inside, in the sanctuary of equations and algorithms, Jeff found his true rhythm. During his sophomore year, Jeff had discovered that his mind worked differently from many of his peers. Where others saw abstract computational problems as academic exercises, he saw practical applications, potential machines, systems, networks that could reshape commerce, information, perhaps society itself. "Professor Hopcroft thinks I should pursue the academic track," Jeff mentioned as they packed up their books later that evening. "Says I have the right kind of mind for research." Martin nodded. "You do. You're methodical. Tenured position by 35, guaranteed." But something in Jeff's expression suggested doubt. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they walked through the computer science building, a utilitarian contrast to the ornate architecture elsewhere on campus. The place smelled of coffee, photocopier toner, and the faint electrical warmth of the VAX terminals where students queued to run their batch jobs. "I'm not sure pure research is where I belong," Jeff finally said. By spring of 1983, Jeff had settled into a particular corner of the computer lab, surrounded by stacks of printouts and dog-eared textbooks. The rhythmic clatter of dot matrix printers formed a backdrop to his concentration as he worked through problems in distributed systems and optimization algorithms. His roommate, Glenn, leaned against the doorframe of their dormitory room one evening. "Are you coming to the party at Colonial?" Jeff glanced up from his desk, where he was sketching system architecture diagrams. "I've got this problem set." "You've always got a problem set," Glenn said, straightening his collar. "The street recruiters will be there. Salomon Brothers, Goldman, you should network." Jeff considered this, then carefully aligned his notes and stood up. "You're right, 15 minutes. At the eating club, investment bankers in crisp suits mingled with juniors and seniors, eager to learn about Wall Street's rapidly evolving landscape. Electronic trading systems were beginning to replace the old open outcry methods. Quantitative finance was the new frontier. "So, you're in computer science?" asked a recruiter from Bankers Trust, swirling an amber drink. "Computer science and electrical engineering," Jeff replied, "with some economics coursework." The man nodded appreciatively. "Perfect combination these days. The street is being rebuilt with code and algorithms. Starting salaries for people who understand both sides are hitting 45, even 50,000. Jeff didn't react to the figure, though it represented nearly triple the median American household income. Instead, he asked, "What kinds of problems are you solving?" The conversation that followed lasted well past Jeff's intended 15 minutes. As he walked back across campus under a canopy of stars, his mind was calculating not just potential salaries but opportunity costs, learning trajectories, and the compounding value of knowledge. "The question isn't whether the solution exists," Professor Cunningham said in his computational complexity seminar in the fall of 1984. "The question is whether we can find it in polynomial time." Jeff, now a junior deeply immersed in his major, found himself increasingly drawn to problems at the intersection of theory and application. Where his classmates debated the aesthetic elegance of pure algorithms, he couldn't help seeing market inefficiencies waiting to be solved. After class, he lingered, watching rain streak the modernist windows of the computer science building. "Something on your mind, Mr. Bezos?" the professor asked, gathering his notes. "I've been thinking about your NP completeness lecture," Jeff said, "the traveling salesman problem." "Ah, yes, famously intractable. But what if we don't need the perfect solution? What if a good approximation, delivered quickly, creates more value than a perfect answer that comes too late?" The professor smiled. "Now you're thinking like an engineer, not a theoretician. Theory says perfection or nothing. Engineering says good enough, on time, under budget." Jeff nodded slowly. "I think I'm an engineer at heart." As he left the building, the first IBM PCs were visible through the windows of the computer lab, their green phosphor screens casting eerie light on the faces of students learning this new, personal computing. The mainframe era was giving way to something more distributed, more accessible. Jeff paused to watch, aware he was witnessing a pivot point in technological history. Summer 1985 found Jeff in a Manhattan skyscraper, interning at a financial firm where his programming skills were put to work on pricing models and inventory algorithms. The city hummed with Reagan-era prosperity, Wall Street traders in suspenders and slicked-back hair, carrying the first mobile phones the size of bricks, while MTV culture filtered through the streets. In the evenings, Jeff would sometimes walk from his temporary apartment to bookstores, losing himself in business biographies and technical journals. He was particularly drawn to the stories of entrepreneurs who had built systems, not just companies, people who had reconceived entire markets or industries around a new architecture. "You're different from the other interns," his supervisor remarked during his performance review. "They're chasing the bonus. You're studying machinery." Jeff smiled slightly. "The machinery is what creates the bonus." The summer passed in a blur of code, financial models, and after-work discussions about market microstructure, the hidden plumbing of capitalism that few people ever saw or understood. By August, Jeff had received an offer to return after graduation, with a starting salary that made his parents' eyes widen when he mentioned it during a weekend visit home. But something held him back from immediate acceptance. "I want to see all my options," he told the hiring manager. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to complete my thesis work first." Senior year arrived with the weight of decisions. Jeff's thesis work delved deeper into computational complexity, but with a distinctly practical bent that sometimes frustrated his more theoretical advisors. He was becoming known among faculty for his written precision, 6-page problem solutions where others needed 12, each step rigorously justified. "You've been summoned," his roommate announced one October evening, tossing an envelope onto Jeff's desk. Inside was an invitation to join Phi Beta Kappa, the oldest academic honor society in America. Jeff set it aside with a small nod of acknowledgement. "Most people would celebrate," his roommate noted. Jeff looked up. "It's nice, but it's just a marker, not the destination." As fall turned to winter, Jeff began receiving more formal recruitment letters, not just from Wall Street, but from tech companies and research institutions. His professors made the case for graduate school, for the pursuit of a PhD and the careful construction of an academic career. "You could make significant contributions to the field," his thesis advisor argued during office hours. "Your approach to complexity theory is innovative." Jeff nodded, respectful but unconvinced. "I'm drawn to problems with stakes," he said finally, "where solving them creates measurable value." "Academia has stakes," the professor countered. "Different kinds," Jeff replied. "I want to build things that work in the world, not just on paper." The spring of 1986 arrived with cherry blossoms and decisions. Jeff sat at a corner table in the campus coffee shop, a legal pad before him with 2 columns meticulously drawn, Academia versus Wall Street. His summa cum laude graduation was assured. His thesis on computational complexity had been well received, with faculty suggesting publication potential. The academic path was clear: graduate school, research, the steady climb toward tenure, and a life of theoretical problems elegantly solved. The other column detailed a different trajectory: Wall Street, with its electronic trading systems, pricing algorithms, and the marriage of computer science with finance. The starting salary would be substantially higher, but the real draw was the applied nature of the work code that moved markets, systems that handled billions in transactions. "Decision matrix?" asked a voice. It was Sarah from his distributed systems class, coffee in hand. Jeff nodded, gesturing to the empty chair. "Mind if I look?" she asked, setting down her cup. He turned the legal pad toward her. Sarah studied it for a moment. "You've listed all the external factors," she observed. "Salary, career progression, intellectual freedom, but nothing about what you want." Jeff's expression remained measured, but something flickered in his eyes. "What I want is to solve interesting problems. Both paths have those." "It is true." He tapped his pen against the table. "But I've realized something this year. I don't just want to identify problems. I want to solve them and then see the solution work in real time, affecting real systems." Sarah nodded. "The marketplace as laboratory." "Exactly," Jeff said, the words crystallizing something he'd felt but not articulated. "The marketplace is the most honest laboratory. Either your solution works and creates value, or it doesn't." A week before graduation, Jeff sat across from his academic advisor in a wood-paneled office lined with mathematics texts and computer science journals. "So you've decided," the professor said. "Yes," Jeff replied. "I'm going to Wall Street. The firm does quantitative trading. It's a perfect application of my skill set." The professor leaned back. "Your computational work here has been exemplary, Jeff. The department would strongly support your PhD application." "I appreciate that," Jeff said, "but I've mapped out what I want to learn next, and Wall Street is where I can learn it best." "Which is?" "How systems work at scale. How to make decisions under uncertainty. How theoretical elegance meets practical constraints." He paused. "And how value is created through information asymmetry resolution." The professor smiled slightly. "That's quite a curriculum." "The market is an efficient teacher," Jeff replied. After the meeting, Jeff walked across the Princeton campus as the late afternoon sun gilded the Gothic towers. 4 years had transformed him from a promising student into something more focused, more deliberate. His skills had crystallized around a core philosophy, written rigor, analytical depth, and a bias toward action. The Challenger disaster earlier that year had been a sobering reminder of system complexity and failure cascades. Wall Street's insider trading scandals were revealing the murky ethics beneath the market's supposed efficiency. The world was not as orderly as academic theory suggested, and this messiness, this gap between model and reality, was precisely where Jeff sensed opportunity. As commencement approached, Jeff finalized his plans. He would start at a Wall Street firm that summer, putting his computational skills to work in the rapidly evolving financial markets. The salary would be substantial, but the real value would be the apprenticeship in applied problem solving and learning how mathematical abstractions translated into profit and loss in the most competitive arena in the world. On graduation day, as he stood in his black robe and mortarboard, Jeff Bezos looked toward the future with quiet confidence. Princeton had given him tools, frameworks, and rigorous thinking. Wall Street would give him a laboratory for testing theories against reality. And somewhere beyond that lay problems still unsolved, systems not yet built, possibilities that existed only as equations waiting for someone methodical enough to solve them. The endless gray rain of Manhattan pattered against the windows of the Fitel office, 36 floors above the frenetic energy of Wall Street. Jeff Bezos stared at the computer screen before him, the green phosphorescent glow illuminating his already intense eyes. The year was 1986, and at 22 he found himself responsible for building the invisible arteries through which the lifeblood of global finance would flow. Dedicated networks connecting banks across continents. Latency, he murmured, scrolling through lines of code. It's all about latency. The trading networks he was building at Fitel weren't simply communication channels, they were time machines of sorts. In financial markets where milliseconds determined millions in profit or loss, the speed of information was currency itself. Jeff understood this viscerally, his mind constantly calculating, optimizing, removing unnecessary steps. The office hummed with the sounds of the late 80s financial revolution. The soft whir of computer fans, the clatter of mechanical keyboards, the distant chime of primitive electronic alerts. The scent of burnt coffee and yesterday's Chinese takeout lingered in the air, mingling with the sterile smell of new computer equipment being unboxed. Shaw Matthews, Jeff's supervisor, approached with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee, setting one down beside the monitor. "You look like you've been at it all night," Shaw said, loosening his Brooks Brothers tie. "Making progress?" Jeff rubbed his eyes and reached for the coffee. "We've got a dedicated line connection working between London and New York. Encryption is solid, but I think we can shave another 300 milliseconds off the transmission time if we reconfigure the routing tables." Shaw raised an eyebrow. 300 milliseconds? That's the difference between executing first or fifth on a currency trade. Our clients would kill for that edge. "Exactly," Jeff nodded, his voice quiet but determined. "In this business, speed isn't just an advantage, it's survival." 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. By 1988, Jeff had traded the controlled chaos of Fitel for the prestigious marble halls of Bankers Trust. The corridors buzzed with expensive Italian suits and the quiet confidence that came with managing billions. Here, derivatives, the complex financial instruments that were transforming Wall Street, were the new frontier. And Jeff found himself at the intersection of mathematical modeling and practical application. His modest office overlooked the city, the twin towers standing sentinel in the distance. On his desk sat a Sun workstation, a technological marvel compared to what many other financial professionals were using. Jeff's role was to integrate technology with risk models, creating systems that could process and execute trades with increasing sophistication. That morning, Richard Collins, a senior vice president, had summoned Jeff to his corner office. Collins, a Princeton alum like Jeff, had taken an interest in the young man's career. "The Black Monday crash last year changed everything," Collins said, referencing the October 1987 market collapse as he gazed out over the skyline. "Program trading took the blame, but what it really exposed was our vulnerability to systemic risks we didn't fully understand." Jeff nodded. "The models failed because they didn't account for feedback loops. When everyone runs for the exit at once, the door gets smaller." Collins turned from the window, studying Jeff with interest. Most people see technology as the problem, you see it as the solution. It's neither, Jeff replied carefully. Technology is an amplifier. It magnifies both wisdom and foolishness. The question is how to build systems that account for human behavior. That's precisely why I wanted to talk to you, Collins said, returning to his desk. We're expanding our derivatives desk, creating products that manage risk rather than just speculate on it. I want you on the team. Jeff felt a surge of excitement. This wasn't just a promotion, it was an invitation into the inner workings of global finance. A chance to see how the entire system functioned from the inside. The Upper East Side apartment wasn't large, but by New York standards, it was decent. A one-bedroom with high ceilings and pre-war moldings. Jeff's furnishings were sparse, a functional sofa, a dining table that doubled as a workstation, and bookshelves filled with technical manuals, business biographies, and science fiction novels. It was late 1989. Outside, snow fell gently on Madison Avenue. Jeff sat at his table, calculator and notebooks spread before him, meticulously updating his personal balance sheet. Nearly 4 years on Wall Street had yielded substantial results. His net worth had now crossed the $100,000 mark, a milestone that meant something to him, though he rarely discussed money in personal terms. He wasn't extravagant like many of his colleagues. No cocaine habits, no Hampton shares, no leased BMW. His indulgence was books, and occasionally good meals at Le Bernardine when closing the deal or celebrating a success. Unlike many on Wall Street who lived paycheck to paycheck despite six-figure salaries, Jeff saved methodically, viewing money as stored energy for future possibilities rather than as a marker of status. The phone rang, interrupting his calculations. It was Paul Milgram, a quantitative analyst he'd met through Princeton connections. Jeff, are you coming to the quant meetup tomorrow? D.E. Shaw will be there. Word is they're doing things that make what we're working on look like an abacus compared to a supercomputer. Jeff glanced at his calendar. I'll be there. I've been hearing about Shaw for months, using predictive algorithms to identify market inefficiencies, right? That's the rumor, Paul confirmed, but they're secretive as hell. Half mathematician, half CIA is how someone described them to me. After hanging up, Jeff returned to his financial planning, but his mind wandered to the evolving landscape. The trading floor, with its shouting, hand signals, and paper tickets, was gradually giving way to electronic systems. The financial world was being rewired, becoming a series of networked computers rather than networked people. This transition fascinated him. Summer 1990. The bankers' trust trading floor thrummed with tension. The savings and loan crisis was in full swing. The Gulf War was brewing, and the economy was sliding toward recession. Yet amidst this volatility, Jeff found clarity. The crisis revealed which systems were robust and which were fragile. In the cafeteria, Jeff sat with Megan Howard, a fellow product developer who had become both colleague and friend over the past 2 years. Another bank failed in Texas yesterday, she said, stirring her coffee. That makes 23 this year. Jeff nodded, his mind processing the implications. The ones that survive this will be stronger. It's like forest fires. They look devastating, but they clear out the underbrush and create space for new growth. Megan studied him. You don't seem worried about any of this. I'm observing, Jeff replied. There's a pattern here. The institutions that are failing all have the same problems. They borrowed short and lent long. They didn't understand their risk exposure, and they had no redundancy built into their systems. He paused. But more importantly, they forgot that cash flow is oxygen. The observation wasn't merely academic. Over 4 years on Wall Street, Jeff had absorbed fundamental lessons about financial plumbing, how money moved, where it pooled, how it could evaporate in an instant. He'd learned that reliable systems created trust, and trust created opportunity. Later that afternoon, Jeff stood in his supervisor's office, discussing the implementation of a new derivatives pricing model that could shave precious seconds off calculation times while improving accuracy. The model works, Jeff explained, but the real innovation is how it integrates with our existing systems. We've created an architecture that can scale as volume increases." His supervisor, Martin Reeves, nodded appreciatively. "This is impressive work, Jeff. The implementation team says your documentation is the most thorough they've ever seen. You've thought through every failure point." Jeff allowed himself a small smile. Systems should be resilient. The world is too unpredictable for them not to be. Walking back to his desk, Jeff felt a familiar restlessness. The work was intellectually challenging, the compensation excellent, and his career trajectory pointed steadily upward. Yet something nagged at him, a sense that the truly transformative changes in finance were just beginning, and that they might extend far beyond trading floors and bank vaults. The cab ride downtown to Harry's bar was slow, caught in the gridlock that defined Manhattan evenings. Jeff used the time to read through the latest issue of Computer World, particularly an article about the growing commercial possibilities of something called the Internet, the sprawling academic and military network that was increasingly connecting university computers across the country. At Harry's, the usual Wall Street crowd gathered, traders, bankers, and analysts unwinding after 14-hour days. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the conversations a mixture of market gossip, political predictions, and the occasional ribald joke. Jeff found his colleagues at a corner table, already 2 rounds deep. Robert Chen, a networking specialist he'd known since Fittle, raised a glass in greeting. "There he is, the man who never sleeps," Robert called out. "What'll you have?" "Scotch, neat," Jeff replied, settling into the empty chair. The conversation flowed easily, touching on market movements, technology developments, and office politics. But it was when discussion turned to the future of banking that Jeff became most engaged. "The whole industry is becoming a giant computer network," he observed. "We're creating an electronic nervous system for global commerce." Michael Durbin, a derivatives trader, laughed. "That's a bit grandiose, isn't it? At the end of the day, we're still just moving money from one pocket to another." "But that's exactly it." Jeff leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Money is just information now. It's bits flowing through networks. The banks that understand this will dominate. The ones that don't will disappear." Later, as the group dispersed into the humid summer night, Robert walked with Jeff toward the subway. "You've changed since Fittel," Robert observed. "More focused. More, I don't know, like you're seeing something the rest of us aren't." Jeff considered this as they descended into the fluorescent glow of the subway station. "I'm just connecting dots," he replied. "The world is being rebuilt in software. Finance is just the beginning." In his apartment that night, Jeff couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the city lights shimmer through a light rain. 4 years on Wall Street had given him a masterclass in how complex systems operated, how they failed, how they recovered, how they evolved. At Fittel, he'd learned that networks were only as valuable as their reliability. At Bankers Trust, he'd seen how financial products could be decomposed into their component parts, then reassembled to create new value. Through both experiences, he'd built a mental model of how large, distributed systems functioned, not just technically, but as economic and social entities. His salary had provided him with a modest but meaningful financial cushion, just over $100,000 in savings and investments. Not a fortune by Wall Street standards, but enough to create options. The rain intensified, streaming down the window in rivulets that distorted the city lights into abstract patterns. Jeff traced one droplet with his finger, watching as it absorbed others in its path, growing larger, accelerating until it disappeared from view. Something was gathering momentum in the world, a convergence of computing power, networking technology, and financial deregulation that was creating new possibilities. Jeff didn't know exactly what form these possibilities would take, but he sensed their magnitude. For now, though, there was work to do, systems to build, lessons to learn. Wall Street was an unforgiving teacher, but it was teaching him precisely what he needed to know: how money moved, how risk was managed, how value was created and destroyed. Every day was adding tools to his toolkit, expanding his network, and clarifying his understanding of what made systems succeed or fail. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jeff finally turned from the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn. The financial world was transforming, and he was positioned at the intersection of its most powerful forces: mathematics, technology, and human behavior. He didn't know it yet, but these years were laying the foundation for everything that would follow, a future where the lessons of Wall Street would be applied to problems far beyond finance, where the systematic thinking he was developing would reshape industries not yet imagined, where the patience he was cultivating would become his greatest competitive advantage. For now, though, there was only the rain, the city, and the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, accumulating the knowledge and resources that would one day allow him to build something truly significant. The relentless hum of the air conditioning system in D. Shaw's midtown Manhattan office provided a constant backdrop to the symphony of keystrokes and hushed conversations. It was 1992, and Jeff Bezos's corner office, small but significant, reflected his rapid rise to vice president at the quantitative hedge fund. The space was Spartan yet purposeful. Financial reports stacked in precise order, a Unix workstation glowing with green text on black background, and a whiteboard covered in formulas and probabilities. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan created a constellation against the night sky. Jeff leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling, mind calculating possibilities as he had been trained to do, not just by his Princeton education, but by his mentor, David Shaw. "The numbers don't lie, Jeff," Shaw had told him earlier that day, his voice measured and precise as always. They stood before a whiteboard filled with statistics on internet growth. 2,300% annual growth. This isn't just an anomaly. This is a discontinuity. In the silence of his office now, Jeff rolled the phrase around in his mind. Discontinuity. A gap in the normal progression of things, a moment where everything changes. The door creaked open, and Mackenzie, his wife of 2 years, entered with 2 cups of coffee. A former D.E. Shaw employee herself, she understood the late nights, the obsessive problem-solving that consumed her husband. "You're still thinking about what David showed you," she said, placing his coffee on the desk. It wasn't a question. Jeff nodded, taking the warm cup between his hands. "There's something here, Mackenzie. The internet. It's not just growing, it's exploding. And no one's really grasping what that means for commerce." "So tell me," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Books," he said simply. "There are over 3 million books in print at any given time. No physical bookstore can stock more than a tiny fraction of that. But an online store could stock everything," she finished his thought. "Exactly. No physical constraints. No established players with significant online presence. It's a blue ocean." The conversation stretched into the early morning hours, possibilities unfolding like origami in reverse, complex ideas unfolding into elegant simplicity. This wasn't just about books. It was about seeing a future others couldn't yet envision. Months passed. Spring of 1994 arrived with cherry blossoms and rain-slicked streets in New York. Jeff's office had transformed into a research center on book publishing, distribution, and internet commerce. Reports on book wholesalers like Ingram and Baker and Taylor were stacked beside printouts of internet growth statistics and nascent e-commerce ventures. David Shaw entered without knocking, a habit of his that Jeff had grown accustomed to. "You've gone deep on this books thing," Shaw observed, scanning the organized chaos. "It makes the most sense as an entry point," Jeff replied, turning from his computer. "Standardized products, no need to touch inventory if we drop ship, and margins that could work if we scale." Shaw nodded, his expression inscrutable. "You realize what you're contemplating means, leaving all this?" He gestured to the office, the implicit 7-figure compensation package that came with being a senior executive at one of Wall Street's most innovative firms. Jeff paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about something I call the regret minimization framework." "Sounds unnecessarily complex for what's essentially a gut decision," Shaw replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Maybe," Jeff acknowledged, "but it helps me think clearly. When I'm 80, looking back on my life, which will I regret more? Staying here or taking a chance on this new thing. Even if it fails, and the odds say it probably will, I'll have tried. Shaw studied his protege for a long moment. You know, most people don't leave seven-figure jobs to sell books on the internet. Most people aren't looking at the same data we are, Jeff countered. As Shaw left, Jeff turned back to his window, watching rain trace patterns down the glass. The decision crystallized in that moment, not from ambition alone, but from a clarity about regret and possibility. He would leave D.E. Shaw. He would start something new. The July heat was oppressive as Jeff and Mackenzie loaded the last of their boxes into their Chevy Blazer. The trunk held their personal belongings, but the back seat was dedicated to something more precious, a computer, business plans, and the embryonic idea that would become Amazon. "You're sure about this?" Mackenzie asked, not for the first time. Jeff smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and revealed his distinctive laugh. "No, but I'm sure about trying." The cross-country drive from New York to Seattle became a transition space, the liminal zone between one life and another. They took turns driving and reading aloud, drafting business plans on a laptop plugged into the car's cigarette lighter. The radio played Pearl Jam and Nirvana, the sound of Seattle reaching out to them before they arrived. "Why Seattle?" a gas station attendant in Ohio asked when Jeff mentioned their destination. "Tax advantages, proximity to Ingram's book warehouse, and a strong technical talent pool from Microsoft." Jeff replied automatically, having rehearsed the answer many times. What he didn't mention was the garage of the house they'd rented in Bellevue, which would become their first office. As they crossed state lines, the conversation evolved from if to when and how. The name Amazon came to them somewhere in the Midwest. Named after the world's largest river, it suggested scale and flow, a perfect metaphor for what Jeff envisioned, the everything store, beginning with books. The garage in Bellevue had no pretensions of grandeur. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, and the persistent smell of fresh lumber from the door desks Jeff had constructed. $60 hollow core doors from Home Depot with 4x4 posts as legs. Functional, cheap, symbolic of the frugality that would become part of the company's DNA. 3 computers sat on these improvised desks, connected to the world through the whine and static of dial-up modems. The sound of connection was the sound of possibility. "We need a bell," Jeff announced one morning in late 1994, as Mackenzie and their first employee, Shell Kafan, looked up from their screens. "A bell?" Shell asked. "For when we make a sale," Jeff explained. "Every sale should be celebrated." It was optimism disguised as practicality. The website wasn't even built yet, but Jeff was already planning for success, not from arrogance, but from a peculiar blend of vision and pragmatism that characterized his thinking. The days developed a rhythm, coding, planning, pitching to potential investors. The nights were for more coding, more planning, and sometimes rare moments of doubt that Jeff shared only with Mackenzie. "What if this is just a bubble?" he asked one night as they sat on the floor of their apartment, eating takeout Chinese food. "What if the internet is just another CB radio, a fad that peaks and fades?" Mackenzie considered this, chopsticks poised mid-air. "Then we'll have tried something extraordinary and failed, and then we'll try something else." Her answer seemed to satisfy him. It wasn't blind optimism, it was clear-eyed acceptance of risk and possibility, the same calculation that had brought them across the country. "So you want to sell books on the internet?" Tom Alberg repeated, swirling the coffee in his mug. They sat in a Seattle cafe, rain tapping against the windows, creating a private bubble of conversation. "Not just sell them," Jeff clarified, "transform how they're sold, and books are just the beginning." Alberg, a former McCaw Cellular executive turned investor, had been initially skeptical when a mutual acquaintance suggested he meet with Jeff. But there was something compelling about the former Wall Street executive who spoke about books and bytes with equal fluency. "Your business plan projects losses for at least 4 years, Alberg noted. "Most investors run from that kind of timeline." "Most businesses think quarter to quarter," Jeff countered. "We're thinking decade to decade." The internet isn't a fad. It's a fundamental shift in how commerce will work. Getting there first matters more than early profitability. As they talked, Jeff outlined what would later become known as the Day One philosophy: customer obsession, long-term thinking, and the willingness to be misunderstood for extended periods. Most people think we're crazy, Jeff acknowledged. They might be right, but if they're wrong— Alberg nodded slowly. Then you've built something extraordinary. He paused. I'm in for 50,000. It wasn't a fortune, certainly not by the standards of the investments Jeff had managed at D.E. Shaw, but it was validation, one of several early checks that would provide the seed capital for Amazon. The board meeting, if such a formal term could be applied to 4 people around a door desk in a garage, convened on a rainy December afternoon in 1994. We need to be clear about what we're building, Jeff said, standing before a whiteboard. Not just an online bookstore, but the most customer-centric company on earth. That's a big claim for a company with no revenue yet, observed Nick Hanauer, another early investor. It's not a claim, Jeff corrected. It's a direction. Everything we build will serve that vision. He outlined what would become Amazon's foundational principles: customer obsession over competitor focus, passion for invention, commitment to operational excellence, and long-term thinking. We'll be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time, he continued. We'll make bold bets, knowing many will fail, but the ones that succeed will more than compensate. As the meeting concluded and the small group dispersed into the rainy Seattle evening, Jeff remained, staring at the whiteboard filled with plans and projections. The garage was quiet except for the soft patter of rain on the roof and the hum of computers. In that moment, between the leaving of Wall Street and the birth of what Amazon would become, Jeff Bezos stood at the fulcrum of his life's work. Behind him lay the structured world of finance, the safety of a vice presidency, the predictable trajectory of success within established parameters. Before him stretched uncertainty, the possibility of spectacular failure, and the chance to build something that didn't yet exist. He erased the day's notes from the whiteboard and wrote a single phrase that would later become famous in company lore: first day. It was a reminder that this was just the beginning, that every day at Amazon would be treated with the urgency, customer focus, and bold decision-making of a startup's first day. It was both a philosophy and a promise. In the years to come, as Amazon grew from a bookseller to the everything store, as Jeff himself transformed from an ambitious entrepreneur to one of the world's wealthiest individuals, this day, one mentality would remain. But on that actual first day, in a garage in Bellevue with rain drumming on the roof, it was simply a man looking into the future and choosing to build it rather than wait for it to arrive. The Seattle rain hammered against the windows of the small garage on Northeast 28th Street in Bellevue, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the furious typing of keyboards. July 1995. Jeff Bezos hunched over his desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his already intense eyes. 5 desks were crammed into the converted garage, a cheap door laid across filing cabinets serving as his workstation. A whiteboard hung nearby, covered in algorithms and projections. The word Amazon sat at the center, circled multiple times. "We're live," he said quietly, his trademark laugh bubbling up from deep in his chest, growing into the full-throated cackle that would eventually become as recognizable as his company. The other 4 people in the room looked up from their stations, momentarily pausing their work. "The world's biggest bookstore just opened," Jeff continued, leaning back in his chair. "And nobody knows it yet." Outside, the mid-90s rolled on in their flannel-clad, dial-up glory. Pearl Jam and Nirvana posters adorned coffee shop walls. Microsoft's Windows 95 was about to launch, and the Netscape IPO was sending Wall Street into a speculative frenzy. But in this garage, Jeff Bezos was playing a different, longer game. The decision to leave his comfortable position as the youngest senior vice president at D.E. Shaw had raised eyebrows. His boss, David Shaw, had taken him on a long walk through Central Park the previous year when Jeff had announced his intention to pursue this internet bookstore idea. "I think this is a good idea," Shaw had said carefully, "but it would be an even better idea for D.E. Shaw." Now, as the rain continued its percussion against the roof, Jeff remembered his response. "I think this is going to be a very big deal someday, and I don't want to miss it." The first order came within hours, a book on artificial intelligence shipped to someone outside the United States. Jeff and his small team celebrated with a toast of cheap champagne in plastic cups. The website was bare bones, white background, blue text links, a simple search bar. But beneath this utilitarian interface lay the seed of something revolutionary. By early 1996, the operation had moved to a small warehouse in an industrial district south of downtown Seattle. Metal shelving units lined concrete floors, and the distinctive smell of cardboard and bookbinding permeated everything. Jeff walked the floor, clipboard in hand, examining the flow of operations. 2 pizza teams, he explained to Nick Hanauer, one of his early investors who had stopped by to see how his money was being spent. No team should be larger than can be fed by 2 pizzas. Hanauer nodded, watching workers pack books into boxes. "And the narratives?" he asked. 6 pages, no PowerPoint, Jeff replied. "Forces clear thinking. If you can't explain your idea clearly in writing, you don't understand it well enough." That night, in his modest home, Jeff sat at his kitchen table working on another document, a vision for what Amazon could become. His wife Mackenzie brought him coffee, then sat across from him with her own work, editing the manuscript that would become her first novel. "Not just books," Jeff said, almost to himself. "Everything." Mackenzie looked up. "One step at a time," she reminded him. "Books first." He nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to music, electronics, toys, categories that could be sold online with the same model. The internet was still new territory for most Americans, with AOL discs arriving in mailboxes across the country, promising hours of free access to this strange new digital frontier. Most businesses saw it as a curiosity. Jeff saw it as the future. The NASDAQ trading floor hummed with activity on May 15, 1997. Traders in brightly colored jackets shouted orders, while others huddled around early computer terminals displaying ticker symbols. Outside, the Clinton years were in full swing: budget surpluses, welfare reform, and economic optimism. Jeff stood on the floor, watching as AMZN began trading at $18 per share. By day's end, the company had raised approximately $54 million, and he still owned roughly 40%. At 33 years old, the former hedge fund executive was now, at least on paper, worth hundreds of millions. "How does it feel?" asked Joy Covey, Amazon's CFO, as they posed for a photograph that would become iconic. Jeff, in his ill-fitting suit, his broad smile and balding head already becoming his trademark image. "It feels like day one," he replied, a phrase that would become a mantra. The photo captured a moment, his slightly awkward posture belying the ambition behind his eyes. But what the photo couldn't capture was the letter he had written to shareholders, a document that would become the company's philosophical cornerstone. Back in Seattle the next week, Jeff gathered his growing team. "Long-term market share appreciation over short-term profitability," he explained, pacing before them. "This is the shareholder letter I wrote. Memorize it. We're going to be saying the same things 20 years from now." The letter outlined a vision that puzzled Wall Street, but energized his team, prioritizing growth and market dominance over immediate profits. Build the infrastructure for something much larger than a bookstore. Focus relentlessly on customer experience. That night, walking through his warehouse, Jeff stopped to help pack books during a sudden surge in orders. A young employee nervously approached him. "Mr. Bezos, shouldn't someone else be doing this? I mean, you're the CEO." Jeff laughed that booming laugh. "Call me Jeff. And no, nobody's too important to pack books when customers are waiting." The holiday season of 1997 tested Amazon's systems to breaking point. Orders flooded in faster than they could be processed. Staff worked around the clock, sleeping on the warehouse floor during peak periods. Jeff was everywhere, answering customer service calls, packing boxes, and troubleshooting website issues. John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins, who had invested in Amazon, visited during this chaos. Rather than being concerned, he was impressed by the controlled frenzy. This is what hypergrowth looks like, Doerr said, watching Jeff move between workstations, solving problems and encouraging his team. Later, over dinner at Canlis, one of Seattle's finest restaurants, though Jeff had initially suggested a more modest venue, Doerr discussed formalized governance structures and the next round of growth capital. "Your margin is my opportunity," Jeff said at one point, explaining his approach to entering new product categories. "Traditional retailers need 30% gross margins. We can operate on much less." Doerr nodded thoughtfully. "You're not just building a store, are you?" "No," Jeff replied. "We're building infrastructure, a platform. Everything in the store is just the beginning." By early 1998, Amazon had expanded beyond books into music and DVDs. The Seattle headquarters had grown to accommodate hundreds of employees. The industrial chic aesthetic, exposed pipes, concrete floors, spare furnishings, reflected Jeff's emphasis on frugality. Where other dot-com companies splurged on Aran chairs and foosball tables, Amazon's desks were famously made from doors with 4x4s as legs. "Why buy expensive desks when we can make these for a fraction of the cost?" Jeff would explain to new hires. "Your comfort matters, but every dollar we save is a dollar we can invest in growth." This frugality extended to his personal life as well. Despite becoming a paper billionaire as Amazon's stock soared, Jeff still drove a modest Honda Accord. His office remained Spartan, with stacks of books being the only decorative elements. One rainy afternoon, 2 young Stanford graduates visited Amazon headquarters. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were working on their search engine project, which they called Google. After demonstrating their technology, they met privately with Jeff. "What do you think?" Sergey asked after their presentation. Jeff was quiet for a moment, his mind calculating possibilities. "I think you're onto something significant," he finally said. Within weeks, Jeff had personally invested $250,000 in their startup through Bezos Expeditions, his private investment vehicle. It would eventually become his most lucrative personal investment. "The internet isn't a zero-sum game," he explained later to his puzzled executives, who questioned why he would invest in another internet company. "A rising tide lifts all boats, and better search means more people are comfortable buying online." Time magazine was preparing its Person of the Year issue for 1999, and Jeff found himself being photographed for the cover. The media attention was intensifying. 60 Minutes had filmed a segment, and business magazines couldn't get enough of the growing Amazon phenomenon. In a quiet moment between photo shoots, Jeff retreated to his office and pulled out a notebook. In it, he'd been jotting ideas for the company's values. 3 phrases had crystallized in his mind: work hard, have fun, make history. His assistant interrupted. "Jeff, the 60 Minutes crew is ready." Before heading out, he scribbled one more note: "It's still day one." The Seattle rain continued outside, just as it had on that first day in the Bellevue garage. But now, Amazon's servers hummed in data centers across the country, processing thousands of orders per hour. The small bookstore had begun its transformation into something much bigger. Exactly as Jeff had envisioned when he'd left New York in his Chevy Blazer, dictating his business plan into a tape recorder while his wife drove. It was indeed still day one. The foundation was laid, the initial public offering had provided capital, and the vision of an everything store was beginning to materialize. Music, electronics, and soon toys were just the start. Jeff Bezos stood at the edge of a new millennium, the architect of what would become one of the most transformative companies in history. As he walked back to the camera crew, Jeff allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The internet revolution was just beginning, and he had positioned Amazon at its very center. Not bad for a company that started in the garage just 3 years earlier, selling nothing but books. The Seattle rain tapped incessantly against the windows of Amazon's headquarters as Jeff Bezos stared at the financial report on his desk. Outside, the gray November skies of 2000 mirrored the somber mood that had settled over the tech industry. The dot-com bubble, which had carried so many digital dreams to dizzying heights, had burst with spectacular violence. Just months earlier, Amazon stock had touched $106 per share. Bezos had been featured on magazine covers, hailed as a visionary. Now the stock hovered near single digits, and the same publications that had celebrated him were publishing obituaries for the e-commerce experiment. "The vultures are circling," said Warren Jensen, Amazon's CFO, placing a fresh stack of newspapers on Bezos's desk. The headlines were brutal. Amazon.bomb, .com dinosaur, the end of the e-tail dream. Bezos's laugh filled the room, that distinctive sound that started as a giggle and crescendoed into a full-bodied roar. His employees had come to recognize it as either a sign of genuine amusement or a defense mechanism against stress. "Let them circle," Bezos said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We're not dead yet." The office around them had changed. Gone were the door desks that once symbolized Amazon's frugal startup culture. They remained, but now they served as actual reminders of necessary austerity rather than performative frugality. The hallways were quieter too. The recent layoffs had cut 15% of their workforce. "The credit line is secured," Jensen said, sliding a folder toward Bezos. $672 million. "The terms aren't great, but we'll survive," Bezos finished. He didn't need to review the punitive interest rates. The European banking consortium had them over a barrel, and everyone knew it. This wasn't growth capital. It was oxygen. Through the glass walls of his office, Bezos could see a team huddled around a whiteboard. They were mapping out the company's core categories: books, music, electronics. Gone were the expansionist plans that had characterized the company's strategy during the boom. The focus now was ruthlessly pragmatic. That night, Bezos drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle in his modest Honda Accord. The radio played news of yet another .com casualty. Pets.com was shutting down after burning through $300 million in just 2 years. Their sock pup pet mascot, once a Super Bowl commercial star, was now a symbol of irrational exuberance. The modest home he shared with Mackenzie was a sanctuary from the storm. She was waiting for him, a glass of wine already poured. On the television, muted business news showed ticker symbols in freefall. "Pets.com is gone," he said, loosening his tie. "I saw," Mackenzie replied. "Webvan doesn't look far behind." Bezos nodded. Webvan, with its billion-dollar war chest and fleet of refrigerated delivery trucks, had been the golden child of the delivery startups. Now it was hemorrhaging cash, unable to solve the fundamental economic equation of home delivery. Their burn rate was unsustainable, Bezos said, more to himself than to Mackenzie. The delivery economics never worked. He sat at the kitchen table, where a stack of papers awaited his attention. Mackenzie knew better than to suggest he leave work behind, even for an evening. Instead, she sat across from him, reading a manuscript while he worked. The comfortable silence between them was built on mutual understanding. "Our stock hit $6.42 today," he said after a while. "I know." "That's a 94% drop from our high." Mackenzie looked up from her book. "Are you worried?" Bezos considered the question. His personal wealth had contracted by billions in the market downturn, from a peak that had briefly made him one of the richest people in tech to a mere fraction of that amount. "About the money? No," he said finally. "About the company? No. About our people? Yes." "You've always said cash flow matters more than stock price," she reminded him. "It does," he agreed, "and we're getting better at it every quarter." Later that night, unable to sleep, Bezos sat in his home office, the blue light of his computer screen illuminating his face. He was reviewing the latest data on Cosmo.com, a company Amazon had invested in that promised 1-hour delivery of everything from movies to ice cream. The numbers were troubling. Like many of its contemporaries, Cosmo had prioritized growth over unit economics, and now reality was setting in. The next morning, Bezos gathered his S-team, the senior leadership in the conference room overlooking Lake Union. The mood was tense. These were the survivors, the ones who remained after the layoffs, the ones tasked with navigating Amazon through the nuclear winter of the .com crash. "I've been thinking about what differentiates us from the companies that are failing," Bezos began. "It's not that we're smarter, it's not that we have better ideas, it's discipline." He walked to the whiteboard and wrote 3 words: cash flow, platforms, patience. Cash flow beats optics, he said, tapping the marker against the first word. We're not building for quarterly earnings releases. We're building a system that generates cash. He moved to the second word. Platforms beat product fads. Books, music, electronics. These aren't our products. Our product is the platform that connects buyers and sellers. Finally, he pointed to the third word. And patience. Patience is our strategic armor. The market may have lost patience with us, but we haven't lost patience with ourselves. The room was silent as his words sank in. We are willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time, Bezos added, a phrase that would eventually become part of Amazon's institutional mantra. In the weeks that followed, Bezos immersed himself in the operational details of the business with renewed intensity. He instituted daily cash flow reviews, scrutinizing every expenditure. Marketing budgets were slashed, expansion plans shelved, and every hire had to be personally approved. The holiday season of 2000 loomed as a make-or-break moment. Bezos took up residence in one of the fulfillment centers, sleeping on an air mattress in a makeshift office. He worked alongside packers and pickers, understanding the bottlenecks, finding efficiencies. It wasn't a publicity stunt. There were no cameras, no reporters. This was survival. In early 2001, Bezos received word that Cosmo.com was on the brink of collapse. The 1-hour delivery service had been unable to make its economics work, despite burning through venture capital at a prodigious rate. It reinforces everything we've learned, Bezos told his team. Delivery is physics, not magic. The last mile is the hardest mile. The lesson was internalized. Amazon would approach delivery with mathematical rigor, not romantic notions of instant gratification. It would build slowly, methodically, with an eye always on unit economics. As winter gave way to spring, Amazon stock hit its nadir, $5.51 per share. Bezos's paper wealth had contracted to about $18 billion, a staggering loss by any standard. Yet his focus remained unwavering. In a meeting with investors, one particularly aggressive analyst challenged Bezos directly. At what point do you admit that the e-commerce experiment has failed? The room tensed. These were brutal times, and investor patience was wearing thin. Bezos took a moment before responding, his voice calm but intense. E-commerce isn't an experiment, he said. It's the future of retail. The question isn't whether it works, but who makes it work. And the answer is whoever has the discipline to focus on customers instead of competitors, on cash flow instead of hype, and on the long term instead of the next quarter. The analyst pressed, but your stock is down over 90%. The stock market is not a voting machine, it's a weighing machine, Bezos replied, channeling his investment hero Warren Buffett. Eventually, it weighs the substance of a company. Right now, it's weighing fear. Our job is to build substance. By mid-2001, subtle signs of stabilization began to appear. The cash flow focus was bearing fruit. The ruthless prioritization of core categories was creating operational efficiencies. And, most importantly, while competitors were failing, Amazon was surviving. In the quiet of his office one evening, Bezos reviewed a report showing that Webvan had filed for bankruptcy. The grocery delivery service had spent nearly $1 billion building infrastructure before figuring out if customers would use it. Now it is gone, joining Pets.com, eToys, and countless others in the .com graveyard. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Rick Dalzell, Amazon's chief information officer. You were right, Dalzell said, dropping a file on Bezos's desk. The platform approach is working. Third-party sellers are up 27% even in this environment. Bezos nodded. While many e-commerce companies had built walled gardens, Amazon had begun opening its platform to other sellers. It wasn't just an online store, it was becoming a marketplace. The more sellers we have, the more buyers will come, Bezos said. And the more buyers we have, the more sellers will come. It's a flywheel. That night, driving home under a rare, clear Seattle sky, Bezos felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of cautious optimism. The worst of the storm had been weathered. Amazon hadn't just survived, it had emerged stronger, leaner, more disciplined. At home, Mackenzie was waiting with news of her own. A major publisher was interested in her novel. They celebrated quietly, a small island of personal joy amid the professional turbulence. "How was your day?" she asked, a question that had become laden with subtext during these difficult months. Bezos considered the question, thinking about the fallen competitors, the credit line that had saved them, the painful layoffs, and the disciplined focus that was slowly turning the tide. "We're going to make it," he said simply. Outside, the stars shone in the clear night sky, a rarity in Seattle. The dot-com winter continued, but for Amazon, the first fragile shoots of spring were beginning to emerge from the frozen ground. The lessons learned, cash flow over optics, platforms over products, patience as strategic armor, would form the foundation for what was to come. But that was a story for another day. Tonight, in the quiet of his home, Jeff Bezos allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the hardest test of his business life had not broken him or his creation. It had only made them stronger. Rain tapped against the windows of his Lake Washington home, a rhythmic percussion accompanying the scratching of his pen across paper. Jeff Bezos paused, looking out at the gray Seattle sky, the year 2005 pregnant with possibility. The lake rippled with tiny waves, the distant shorelights blurred by mist. His 6-page narrative, no PowerPoint, never PowerPoint, was nearly complete. Prime, he had written at the top, a simple word with complex implications. After the dot-com crash and the slow rebuild of Amazon's fortunes, Jeff had been contemplating the fundamental problem of e-commerce, friction. Even with one-click purchasing, shipping costs remained a psychological barrier. Customers would fill their carts only to abandon them when faced with shipping fees. The math was clear: households that ordered frequently spent more, yet shipping uncertainty depressed order frequency. "People are willing to pay for predictability," Jeff murmured, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked window. $79 a year, a subscription that would transform occasional buyers into members, a psychological shift from transaction to relationship. The phone rang. Jeff answered, recognizing the number. "Good morning, Jeff," said the deep, steady voice of Andy Jassy, a Harvard Business School graduate who had become one of his most trusted lieutenants. "Andy, how's the infrastructure project coming?" A pause. "That's why I'm calling. We're ready to take it outside." Jeff smiled. This was the other pillar of his vision, monetizing the massive computing infrastructure Amazon had built for itself. Amazon Web Services. Cloud computing before most people understood what the cloud was. "The team's convinced we can offer storage and compute capacity to other businesses at utility pricing," Andy continued. "S3 for storage, EC2 for computers. Pay only for what you use." The world's biggest bookstore becoming the world's biggest computing utility, Jeff mused. "Let's move forward." After the call, Jeff drove to headquarters. The rain had become a drizzle, typical Seattle weather in a city transforming itself. Construction cranes dotted South Lake Union as Amazon's new campus took shape. Around him, iPod-wearing pedestrians walked past coffee shops where baristas practiced third-wave brewing techniques, the aroma of single-origin beans wafting onto sidewalks. In the boardroom, his senior team assembled. No slide decks, only printed 6-page narratives. The first 5 minutes were spent in silence, reading. Jeff watched as his executives absorbed the prime proposal, their expressions shifting as they processed the implications. "This is a huge bet," said the CFO, breaking the silence. "Shipping is our second largest expense after the cost of goods. If adoption exceeds projections, we could lose hundreds of millions." Jeff nodded. "It's high variance, but high variance isn't bad if the expected value is positive. Consumer psychology suggests it will work," added the marketing executive. "Once they've paid for unlimited shipping, they'll want to extract value. Their shopping behavior will change to justify the membership." Jeff leaned forward. "It's a flywheel. More Prime members means more volume. More volume means better economies of scale. Better economics means we can invest in faster shipping, which makes Prime more valuable, which gets us more members. He made a circular motion with his finger, round and round. The meeting continued, dissecting every angle. Jeff listened, occasionally steering, but mostly absorbing. His leadership style had evolved. He preferred to hire brilliant people and give them autonomy, provided they adhered to certain principles. Later that day, in a smaller conference room, he met with the marketplace team. Third-party sellers now represented a growing percentage of Amazon's business. Another flywheel: more sellers meant greater selection, which attracted more customers, which attracted more sellers. The take rate is healthy, reported the marketplace lead, 15 to 45%, depending on category and services. Sellers get access to our customer base. We get expanded selection without inventory risk. Jeff nodded, seeing how the pieces fit together. And fulfillment? We're testing fulfillment by Amazon. Sellers ship inventory to our warehouses. We handle storage, picking, packing, and shipping, plus customer service. The strategy was clear. Amazon would build infrastructure at scale, then allow others to leverage it, capturing margin while expanding the ecosystem. First with Marketplace, now with AWS. Infrastructure as a service. Outside, evening had fallen. Jeff walked through the engineering floor, where two pizza teams grouped small enough to be fed with two pizzas, worked on discrete projects. The cultural tools were taking shape. Small, autonomous teams, written narratives rather than presentations. The bar raiser hiring program to ensure talent quality, the leadership principles that guided decision-making. Disagree and commit, he told a team leader earlier that day when they reached an impasse. You don't have to agree, but once we decide, you're all in. The following year, 2006, marked AWS's official launch. Jeff stood with Andy Jassy at the announcement, watching as developers signed up for the service that would eventually transform the computing landscape. It's utility computing, Andy explained to the gathered press. Like electricity, you don't generate your own power, you plug into the grid and pay for what you use. Behind the simplicity lay enormous complexity. Data centers spread across regions, redundant systems, constant monitoring. The margins would prove extraordinary compared to retail's razor-thin profitability. AWS would become the profit engine that funded Amazon's retail expansion and other ambitious projects. That evening, over dinner at Serious Pie, a wood-fired pizza restaurant in the Belltown neighborhood, Jeff and Andy discussed the bifurcation of Amazon's business model. Retail will always operate on thin margins, Jeff said, cutting into a pizza topped with seasonal mushrooms. 5% if we're lucky. But AWS has the potential for 30% operating margins. Different businesses, different economics, Andy agreed. But the same principles, Jeff added. Customer obsession, long-term thinking, willingness to be misunderstood. Outside, the Great Recession was beginning to take shape, though few recognized it yet. Housing prices were peaking, credit default swaps were accumulating risk, and banks were over-leveraged. But inside Amazon's growing empire, the flywheels were spinning faster. By 2008, as financial institutions collapsed and the global economy teetered, Amazon continued expanding. The fulfillment center network grew across the United States, Europe, and Asia. Massive warehouses where an increasingly sophisticated logistics operation took shape. Data and algorithms optimized every aspect, which products to store where, the most efficient picking routes, the optimal packaging. In a fulfillment center outside Phoenix, Jeff toured the floor, watching workers pick products guided by handheld scanners. The future would include robotics. Amazon had been eyeing Kiva systems, but for now, it was human labor combined with software intelligence. The last mile is our next frontier, Jeff told the fulfillment center director, controlling more of the delivery network. Back in his Seattle office, rain once again streaking the windows, Jeff drafted another 6-page document. This one outlined his vision for doubling Amazon's experimental capacity. If you double the number of experiments you do per year, you're going to double your inventiveness, he wrote. The philosophy applied across the company: test, measure, iterate. High-velocity decision-making. Not all experiments would succeed, but the learning would compound. The culture wasn't without friction. Stack ranking, evaluating employees against one another, created internal competition. Some criticized the pace and pressure, but Jeff believed in raising the bar continuously. The bar raiser program ensured that each new hire was better than 50% of existing employees in their role, gradually elevating the talent pool. In late 2009, as the global economy struggled to recover, Amazon stock had more than doubled from its recession low. Prime membership was growing steadily, Marketplace was expanding, and AWS was accelerating. The three flywheels reinforced each other, creating a system greater than the sum of its parts. On a rare, clear Seattle evening, Jeff sat on his deck overlooking Lake Washington. The water reflected the lights of the city, a city Amazon was reshaping. He thought about the infrastructure he'd built, not just physical but philosophical. The mechanisms that turned intentions into consistent behaviors. The principles that guided thousands of decentralized decisions. The bar raiser program ensures talent quality. The leadership principles serve as decision-making guardrails. The 6-page narratives force clarity of thought. The two pizza teams maintained agility despite growing size. The disagree and commit philosophy allows progress despite disagreement. All were cultural tools designed to scale what couldn't be directly controlled: good judgment. His phone buzzed with an email from Andy Jassy. AWS had signed another major client, this one migrating their entire infrastructure to the cloud. Jeff smiled. The bet on infrastructure was paying off. While competitors focused on applications and user experiences, Amazon had built the foundational layers: fulfillment centers, data centers, payment systems, customer service operations, that others would struggle to replicate. The network effects were strengthening. Each new Prime member, each new marketplace seller, each new AWS customer made the entire system more valuable. Data flowed through the ecosystem, improving recommendations, inventory forecasting, and operational efficiency. As night fell over Seattle, the tech landscape was shifting. YouTube, launched the same year as Prime, had been acquired by Google. Facebook was expanding beyond colleges. The iPhone was transforming mobile computing. But Amazon's infrastructure play was more fundamental, less visible but more enduring. Jeff turned to go inside, pausing for one last look at the lake. The infrastructure wasn't sexy, but it was powerful. Fulfillment centers, data centers, payment systems, Prime, Marketplace, AWS, each a flywheel spinning faster, generating momentum that would carry Amazon forward through the next decade and beyond. The rain returned, gentle at first, then steady. Seattle's persistent drizzle nurturing the city's growth. Inside, Jeff returned to his desk, where another 6-page document awaited his attention. Another experiment, another bet on the future. The flywheels continued turning, gaining momentum with each revolution. The Everything Store was becoming the Everything Company, built on infrastructure designed to last decades. Behind it all was Jeff Bezos, patiently assembling the pieces of his vision, one flywheel at a time. The robots moved like dancers in an industrial ballet, their orange chassis gliding across the warehouse floor with inhuman precision. Jeff Bezos stood on a raised platform, watching the choreographed motion of the Kiva robots as they lifted entire shelves of products and delivered them to stationary human pickers. His eyes narrowed, calculating efficiency gains with every passing second. 22% improvement in throughput, said the operations manager beside him. Labor costs down 18% per order. Jeff nodded, saying nothing. The 2012 acquisition of Kiva Systems had cost $775 million, a steep price, but the robotics company was already transforming Amazon's fulfillment centers. In the quiet hum of the warehouse, he heard the future. And injury rates? He asked finally, his voice soft. The manager hesitated. We're working on that data. Seattle rain tapped against the high windows of the fulfillment center, creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the whirring robots below. Jeff checked his watch, a practical timepiece, not the luxury brand many billionaires favored. He lived differently than most men of his wealth. His salary remained just $81,840, a middle manager's compensation, with his fortune built almost entirely in Amazon stock. He maintained his residence in Washington state, where there was no state income tax, and used stock-backed loans when he needed liquidity without triggering capital gains. Money was a system, and Jeff optimized systems. Later that evening, in his lakefront home, Jeff sat in near darkness, only the blue glow of a laptop illuminating his face. The 2013 quarterly numbers were strong. Revenue up, AWS, growing faster than even internal projections had suggested. Yet something nagged at him. On the screen, he scanned an article about workplace conditions in Amazon's warehouses. The criticism wasn't new. It had been building since 2011, but the tone was shifting. More mainstream outlets were picking up the story. His phone vibrated. It was Jay Carney, the former White House press secretary who had joined Amazon to manage its increasingly complex political interface. "Did you see the piece?" Jay asked without preamble. "Looking at it now. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The political environment is changing. Tech isn't getting the free pass it used to." Jeff considered this. "We need to get ahead of it. Data-driven response. Real improvements were warranted." And the Post? They've been covering the workplace stories too. Editorial independence, Jeff said. That was the promise. The Washington Post acquisition had been completed earlier that year for $250 million, a personal purchase through his holding company Nash Holdings, not an Amazon transaction. He had assured the newsroom of their editorial freedom. If the Post investigated Amazon, so be it. The purchase wasn't about controlling a narrative. It was about reinventing a storied institution for the digital age. At least, that's what he told himself in the quiet hours. The following morning, Jeff sat across from Charlie Rose in the CBS studios. The 60 Minutes cameras captured his practiced smile, his calculated enthusiasm. They were discussing innovation, Amazon's future plans, when Jeff leaned forward with conspiratorial excitement. "I want to show you something," he said. The segment aired that December 2013 evening to millions, small octocopter drones carrying Amazon packages, delivering them to customers' doorsteps within 30 minutes of ordering. America watched, captivated by the science fiction becoming reality. "How soon will we see them?" Charlie Rose asked. "I think this is years away," Jeff admitted. But the timeline wasn't the point. The segment generated exactly what he intended. A wave of press coverage, regulatory discussions, and public fascination. Amazon wasn't just an online retailer, it was a technology company pushing boundaries. Later that night, Jeff received a text from Dave Limp, who oversaw devices off AA already called 3 times. He smiled slightly. The drone reveal had accomplished its mission. As 2014 progressed, Jeff divided his attention between Amazon's expanding empire and the renovation of the Washington Post. In the Post's offices, the digital transformation was underway. New content management systems, analytics tools, mobile optimization. Subscriptions were trending upward for the first time in years. "We can't save journalism by clinging to old models," he told the Post's leadership team. "The internet destroyed the old business, but it can build the new one." The irony wasn't lost on him that his first fortune had come from disrupting traditional retail, and now he was trying to rescue a pillar of traditional media. But Jeff didn't see contradiction, only evolution. Back in Seattle, the construction of the Amazon spheres had begun, 3 intersecting glass domes that would house 40,000 plants from around the world. Not standard corporate headquarters, but a controlled rainforest in the heart of South Lake Union. The neighborhood had transformed around them, rents soaring as tech workers filled apartments and coffee shops. Not everyone celebrated the change. In his office, Jeff met with Jeff Wilker, who ran the consumer business. The automation pipeline is solid, Wilker reported, but we have a problem with the Times. The New York Times had been working on an investigation of Amazon's corporate culture for months. Reporters had interviewed over 100 current and former employees. The picture emerging wasn't flattering. What are they finding? Jeff asked. Data-driven management taken to extremes. People crying at their desks. Annual culling of the bottom performers. Jeff steepled his fingers. Is any of it factually incorrect? Wilker hesitated. Not incorrect, but incomplete. They're not capturing the why, the customer obsession, the willingness to be misunderstood for long periods. When the Times article appeared in August 2015, the headline said it all. Inside Amazon, wrestling big ideas in a bruising workplace. The piece described a corporate culture of midnight emails, harsh feedback, and employees pushed to their breaking points. Jeff responded immediately with an internal memo, then the public statement urging any employee experiencing the described treatment to contact him directly. But the narrative damage was done. That night, alone in his study, Jeff read the article a seventh time. The criticism stung, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it failed to understand the purpose behind the pressure. The standards were high because the mission demanded it. Day one thinking, the startup mentality he insisted on maintaining, required intensity. The years between 2010 and 2016 had seen Amazon transform from an online retailer to a technological ecosystem. AWS dominated cloud computing. Prime membership was locked in tens of millions of households. The Kindle had revolutionized reading. Echo and Alexa were changing how people interacted with their homes. Yet with scale came scrutiny. The company that had once been celebrated as an innovator was increasingly portrayed as a behemoth. Politicians from both parties questioned Amazon's market power. Labor organizers highlighted warehouse conditions. European regulators examined tax practices. In early 2016, sitting in the modest conference room where the company had begun, Jeff drafted his annual shareholder letter. He wrote about maintaining day one, the philosophy of treating every day like the company's first, avoiding the complacency that came with success. Day two is stasis, he typed, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death. He paused, reading the words. Perhaps too apocalyptic? No, the existential fear that had driven him from the beginning remained essential. Comfort was the enemy. His personal investment strategy through Bezos expeditions mirrored this philosophy. He had placed bets on companies like Airbnb, Uber, and Twitter founder-led platforms with strong network effects. He recognized the patterns because he had built one himself. On a rare, clear Seattle evening, Jeff stood on the balcony of his home, looking toward Lake Washington. His wealth had reached nearly $60 billion, making him one of the richest people on the planet. The journey from online bookstore to global power had taken just over 20 years. The phone rang. It was his personal assistant. "The Blue Origin team is ready," she said. His space company, founded in 2000, had been making steady progress. While Elon Musk's SpaceX captured headlines, Blue Origin had worked methodically toward its goals. The tortoise approaches, not the hare. Jeff's long-term vision extended beyond Earth's atmosphere, beyond quarterly earnings, beyond conventional timelines. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. As his car navigated Seattle's evening traffic, Jeff reviewed mental notes for the Blue Origin meeting. The company motto, Gradatim Ferociter, Latin for step by step, ferociously, reflected his broader philosophy: patience and intensity, methodical progress and bold vision, the tension between immediate execution and distant horizons. It was the same approach that had built Amazon, that had acquired the Washington Post, that had weathered the scrutiny now intensifying around his companies. The ability to operate simultaneously in the present and the future, to deliver this quarter's results while planting seeds for decades hence. The car turned onto a private road leading to the Blue Origin facility. Jeff glanced at his phone one last time before the meeting. A news alert showed an Occupational Safety and Health Administration report about Amazon warehouse injuries, another front in the expanding battle for public opinion. He put the phone away, one problem at a time, one step at a time, ferociously. Inside, engineers waited with rocket designs and launch schedules. Earth problems will be there tomorrow. Tonight, he would look to the stars. The Seattle rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jeff Bezos' office at Amazon headquarters. Outside, the gray November sky of 2017 hung low over Lake Union, the city's towers dissolving into mist. Inside, Bezos studied the Bloomberg terminal on his desk, watching as Amazon's stock ticked upward again, pushing his net worth briefly past $100 billion, making him, for a moment, the richest person in modern history. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his now famous shaved head. The journey from online bookstore to everything store to cloud computing giant had been a marathon disguised as a series of sprints, 23 years of relentless forward motion. "Mr. Bezos," his assistant said from the doorway, "the meeting about the Day One Fund is ready when you are." He nodded, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. The Day One Fund had been percolating in his mind for months, a $2 billion commitment focused on homelessness and education. Not the scattershot philanthropy many expected, but targeted investment in areas where he believed his approach might make meaningful difference. "The trick isn't giving money away," he had told his executive team earlier that week. "The trick is giving it away with the same discipline we use to build the business." The boardroom was filled with his most trusted advisors when he arrived. Large windows revealed Seattle's skyline, the Space Needle distant in the mist. For 2 hours, they debated the mechanics of the fund's 2 branches, homelessness grants and a network of Montessori-inspired preschools they'd call Day One Academies. "We're not charities," Bezos reminded them. "We're looking for scale, for system-level change." Later that evening, as his driver navigated the rain-slicked streets toward his Medina estate, Bezos scrolled through messages on his phone. Mackenzie had texted to say she'd be working late on her novel. 25 years of marriage, and they were increasingly moving in separate orbits, his expanding business empire, her literary pursuits. He felt the first tremors of what would become a seismic shift in his personal life, though he couldn't yet name it. Spring 2009 brought a different kind of rain to the Bezos empire. The divorce announcement in January had been carefully orchestrated, a joint Twitter statement designed to present unity amid dissolution. But the tabloid frenzy that followed was anything but controlled. When the National Enquirer threatened to publish private text messages and intimate photos, Bezos did something uncharacteristic. He went public. In a Medium post titled, "No Thank You, Mr. Pecker," he published the extortion emails from AMI, the Enquirer's parent company. "Of course, I don't want personal photos published, but I also won't participate in their well-known practice of blackmail," he wrote from his study, the Lake Washington waters visible through rain-streaked windows. The calculated transparency transformed the narrative overnight. The predator became the prey. The billionaire became, improbably, a sympathetic figure standing against tabloid bullying. When the divorce settlement was finalized in April, Mackenzie received approximately 25% of their Amazon holdings, roughly $38 billion in stock. She promptly announced plans for significant charitable giving, signing the giving pledge that Bezos himself had never joined. Grateful for her support and for her kindness in this process, Bezos tweeted, even as he retained voting control of her shares. That same spring brought another public relations challenge. After a 14-month contest that had seen cities across America competing for Amazon's second headquarters, the company abruptly withdrew from its New York City plans amid fierce progressive backlash over $3 billion in proposed subsidies. "We don't think we can build the kind of partnerships we need in Long Island City," the press release stated. The Arlington, Virginia location moved forward as planned. In his Medina home office that evening, Bezos poured a small glass of whiskey and gazed at the rain-rippled lake. The company that had once been an insurgent was now viewed as an incumbent, powerful, possibly threatening. The regulatory landscape was shifting beneath his feet. The summer of 2020 found Bezos in a paradoxical position. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated Amazon's growth beyond even his ambitious projections. Homebound consumers turned to online shopping in unprecedented numbers. Businesses migrating to remote work drove AWS revenue to new heights. Amazon hired hundreds of thousands of workers to meet surging demand. Yet the billionaire's wealth explosion, his fortune nearly doubled during the pandemic, intensified public scrutiny. Warehouse workers organized for better conditions, antitrust regulators circled. In July, Bezos appeared via Zoom before the House Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee alongside the CEOs of Apple, Facebook, and Google. From a wood-paneled room, he defended Amazon's business practices, while representatives displayed charts of the company's growing market power. "We compete against established players like Target, Costco, Kroger, and, of course, Walmart," Bezos testified, his voice measured through the video feed. Together, those companies are many times larger than Amazon. After the hearing, alone in his study, he drafted notes for what would become the $10 billion Bezos Earth Fund, a climate-focused initiative that represented his largest philanthropic commitment to date. The fund would make grants to scientists, activists, and non-profits working to address climate change. "Scale matters in philanthropy too," he told advisor Jay Carney. "We need to approach this with the same systems thinking we apply to the business." That fall, as Amazon fought against the unionization drive at its Bessemer, Alabama warehouse, Bezos began contemplating a transition. Andy Jassy, who had built AWS into the company's profit engine, was the natural successor. "It's time," Bezos told the board in a closed-door meeting. "AWS is the future of the company, and Andy understands our culture at the molecular level." On February 2, 2021, Bezos announced he would step down as Amazon's CEO in the third quarter, transitioning to executive chairman. The timing was auspicious. Amazon had just reported its first $100 billion quarter and was projecting its best ever year for net income. "Being the CEO of Amazon is a deep responsibility, and it's consuming," he wrote to employees. "When you have responsibility like that, it's hard to put attention on anything else." The spring and summer of 2021 unfolded as a carefully choreographed changing of the guard. Jassy shadowed Bezos through crucial meetings. The founder gradually withdrew from day-to-day operations while maintaining strategic oversight. On July 5, 2021, exactly 27 years after founding Amazon in his garage, Bezos officially handed the CEO title to Jassy. 2 weeks later, he boarded a Blue Origin New Shepard rocket for an 11-minute suborbital flight alongside his brother Mark, aviation pioneer Wally Funk, and Dutch teenager Oliver Damon. The cowboy hat he wore at the post-flight press conference became an instant meme, a visual contrast to his normally calculated public image. "The best day ever," he declared after the capsule touched down in the West Texas desert. Back in Seattle that evening, Bezos sat alone on the terrace of his lakeside home, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. Blue Origin, funded through approximately $1 billion in annual Amazon stock sales since 2017, represented both his boyhood dream and his vision for humanity's future. "Earth is the best planet," he often said. "We should work to protect it. But if we want to continue growing as a civilization, we need to move heavy industry into space." As executive chairman, he now focused on three primary spheres: Amazon's long-term vision, Blue Origin's space ambitions, and his expanding philanthropic portfolio. The Washington Post, which he'd owned since 2013, continued its digital transformation under his stewardship. In his study that night, he drafted notes for Amazon's upcoming board meeting. The company faced intensifying regulatory scrutiny, labor challenges, and the post-pandemic normalization of e-commerce growth. Yet its fundamental position, dominant in online retail, cloud computing, and increasingly in advertising, remained formidable. "Day one is still day one," he wrote, echoing the mantra that had guided the company since its founding. Competitors come and go, customer obsession endures. Outside, the Seattle rain resumed its gentle percussion against the windows. Inside, the world's second richest man contemplated not just wealth accumulation but legacy construction, the infrastructure, media holdings, climate initiatives, and space ventures that would outlast him. The digital clock on his desk silently marked the passage of time. Each second, each minute represented both opportunity and obligation. The obligation to deploy capital at scale. The opportunity to shape humanity's future. The weight and the privilege of resources beyond comprehension. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by books and technology, Jeff Bezos gazed at the rain-blurred lights of Seattle and considered what comes after empire building. What happens when the builder sets down his tools and asks, "What have I built? What will it become? And what, in the final accounting, will it all have been for?" The desert air held a particular stillness at dawn, something Jeff Bezos had come to appreciate during his retreats to the West Texas launch facility. Standing before the gleaming hull of New Shepard, Blue Origin's suborbital rocket, he ran his hand along the smooth metal, feeling the cool surface against his palm. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty landscape, illuminating the company logo, a feather symbolizing the perfect flight. "We're on track for the lunar landing module," said Bob Smith, Blue Origin's CEO, approaching with a tablet displaying the latest test results. "The NASA contract is transforming what we can accomplish." Jeff nodded, his mind already calculating trajectories beyond the $3.4 billion Artemis program award from 2023. "It is good, but I want us thinking about what comes after. The moon isn't the destination, it's just the gateway." At 59, Jeffrey Preston Bezos carried himself with the same measured intensity that had built Amazon from an online bookstore into a $500 billion empire. His trademark laugh, a staccato burst that once echoed through Amazon's early Seattle offices, had become more controlled, more deliberate, like everything else in his carefully constructed universe. The Blue Origin compound represented just one facet of his expanding constellation of interests. By 2024, his net worth hovered around $180 billion, fluctuating with the rhythms of Amazon's stock price, where he still held roughly 10% ownership. Approximately 990 million shares after his divorce from Mackenzie Scott. His phone buzzed with a text from Andy Jassy, his successor at Amazon CEO, Q3 numbers looking strong. $575 billion annual revenue projections holding. Healthcare integration exceeds expectations. Jeff allowed himself a small smile. The one medical acquisition in 2023 had been scrutinized, but the healthcare venture was beginning to demonstrate what he had always believed, that system inefficiencies represented opportunities. The same principle that had guided Amazon's expansion into cloud computing through AWS, which now commanded nearly a third of the global market. Back in his private quarters, Jeff prepared for his morning routine with monastic discipline. 8 hours of sleep, non-negotiable. A protein-rich breakfast eaten while reading briefings from his various enterprises. His schedule had been crafted with scientific precision to maximize what he called high IQ time, those morning hours when cognitive function peaked. "Sir, the Kourou is ready to depart from Monaco next Tuesday," his assistant said through the intercom, referring to the 417-foot sailing yacht delivered in 2023. "One of the largest in the world." "Confirm it," Jeff replied, "and make sure we have the Earth Fund meeting documents prepared for the on-board session." The Bezos Earth Fund, his $10 billion commitment to combat climate change, had distributed nearly $800 million in a single 2022 grant round to 16 organizations. The scale matched his philosophy. Meaningful change required substantial capital deployed strategically, not symbolic gestures. Later that morning, his G650ER private jet carried him back to Seattle. From 45,000 feet, he gazed down at the patchwork of American commerce, the highways and logistics centers, many now featuring Amazon's distinctive blue vans, an increasing percentage of them electric Rivian models that his investment had helped bring to market. The plane's secure connection allowed him to review the latest memo from Amazon's robotics division. The company culture he had established decades earlier persisted beyond his CEO tenure. 6-page narrative documents instead of PowerPoint, reading sessions conducted in silence before discussion, decisions made with data and long-term thinking. We've reduced injury rates by 18% while increasing automation by 35%, the document noted, addressing one of the persistent criticism points that had shadowed Amazon's growth. Not enough, Jeff wrote in the margin. What mechanisms ensure continuous improvement rather than meeting a target? His question reflected the management philosophy that had become almost mystical in business circles, the focus on process rather than outcomes, systems rather than goals, and what he famously called day one thinking, the perpetual mindset of a startup despite Amazon's massive scale. As the Seattle skyline came into view, the Amazon sphere's 3 intersecting biodomes filled with 40,000 plants from cloud forest ecosystems stood distinct among the conventional high-rises. The $4 billion corporate headquarters represented his belief that environment shaped thinking, that innovation required both discipline and wonder. At his Beverly Hills estate, purchased for $175 million in 2020 from media mogul David Geffen, Jeff hosted a small gathering that evening. The 9-acre Warner estate, with its terraced gardens, offered privacy that his public persona rarely afforded. The guest list included scientists from Altos Labs, the anti-aging research company he had helped fund in 2021. "We're making progress on cellular reprogramming," said one researcher, a Nobel laureate in medicine. "The investment horizon is longer than most venture funds would tolerate." "Time is the only true constraint," Jeff replied, swirling a glass of wine. "I'm not looking for quarterly returns on longevity research." His interest in extending human lifespan dovetailed with his space ambitions. Both represented his peculiar blend of pragmatism and audacity. His willingness to pursue decades-long objectives while most of the business world remained fixated on the next quarter. The conversation shifted to the regulatory challenges facing Amazon. The Federal Trade Commission under Lina Khan had intensified scrutiny of the company's market power, filing lawsuits that targeted core business practices. "They fundamentally misunderstand our model," Jeff said. "Amazon succeeds by creating consumer surplus, not by extracting it. But we've been misunderstood for long periods before." His phone buzzed again, a text from his eldest son, Preston, now an adult navigating his own path with the complicated legacy of being a Bezos heir. "Dad, saw the coverage of the latest Blue Origin launch. Proud of what you're building." These moments, the quiet acknowledgement of his work from those who mattered most, provided satisfaction that transcended the financial metrics that dominated public discussion of his achievements. Later that night, alone in his study, Jeff reviewed the latest disbursement reports from the Day One Academies Fund. The preschool network he had established to provide Montessori-inspired education in underserved communities. The schools were scaling according to plan, though more slowly than Amazon had in its heyday. Education, he had discovered, resisted the same velocity of innovation that technology embraced. His tax statement sat nearby, documents that reflected what ProPublica had once called his true tax rate of less than 1% between 2014 and 2018. The legal strategy was sound and common among the ultra-wealthy, minimal salary, appreciation rather than income, strategic borrowing against assets rather than liquidation. Yet the optics remained challenging in an era of heightened scrutiny of economic inequality. Jeff understood the paradox of his public image, the frugal founder who still evangelized the door desk culture of Amazon's garage days, while simultaneously owning multiple mansions, a superyacht, and a space company. The same man who carefully tracked office supply costs in Amazon's early years now commanded resources that exceeded the GDP of many nations. "The narrative isn't the reality," he had told a close confidant recently, "but perception shapes policy, so we have to be aware of it." At his desk, no longer a door on sawhorses, but still deliberately understated. Jeff opened his journal and began to write. The practice, maintained for decades, provided clarity when the complexity of his empire threatened to become overwhelming. Amazon, at $575 billion revenue, 1.5 million employees, 200 million plus Prime members, AWS at 32% market share. Numbers that were unimaginable in 1994, he wrote. And yet it still feels like day one. The following morning brought a series of high-level meetings at Amazon's headquarters, where he maintained an office despite stepping down as CEO. The company's leadership team still sought his counsel on strategic decisions, particularly those with long-term implications. "We're seeing pressure from all sides," Andy Jassy explained during a private discussion. "Regulators want us smaller, Wall Street wants more profit, labor wants higher wages, and customers still expect lower prices and faster delivery." "What would you do if Amazon disappeared tomorrow and you had to rebuild it from scratch?" Jeff asked, employing his characteristic thought experiment approach. "Which constraints would you accept as immutable, and which would you challenge?" The question reflected his enduring management philosophy, the belief that constraints should be questioned, that conventional wisdom was often wrong, and that true innovation required intellectual courage. Later, at a Blue Origin strategic planning session, the discussion centered on the company's measured pace compared to SpaceX's rapid iteration. "Elon moves faster," said one executive. "The public narrative favors his approach." "Safety and reliability create the foundation for true scale," Jeff countered. "We've been building for decades, not headlines." The tortoise strategy requires patience, but is the right one for opening space to millions, not just a few pioneers. As evening fell over Seattle, Jeff visited the Mary's Place family shelter embedded within one of Amazon's office buildings, a project he had championed to address homelessness in the company's hometown. The shelter, operating since 2020, provided transitional housing for families while connecting them with resources to achieve stability. "We've helped over 2,000 families transition to permanent housing," the program director explained as they toured the facility. "The integration with Amazon's infrastructure has been transformative." Jeff nodded, seeing in the project a microcosm of his philanthropic approach, identifying systemic inefficiencies, applying resources at scale, and measuring outcomes with the same rigor he brought to business. Back at his lakeside home in Medina, Washington, purchased decades earlier when Amazon was still primarily a bookseller, Jeff ended his day with a ritual call to his parents. Despite his wealth and influence, these connections to his pre-Amazon life remained sacred, anchoring him to the values formed long before he became a global figure. "The Earth Fund is announcing another major grant tomorrow," he told his mother. "Climate adaptation technology for vulnerable coastal communities." "You always did think about the big picture," she replied, "even when you were dismantling your crib with a screwdriver as a toddler." After the call, Jeff stepped onto his dock overlooking Lake Washington. The Seattle night was clear, the stars visible despite the city lights. He found Orion, the hunter constellation that had fascinated him since childhood visits to his grandfather's ranch in Texas. In the quiet moment, he reflected on the questions that increasingly occupied his thoughts. What would remain of his work in 100 years? Would Amazon's customer obsession endure beyond his influence? Would Blue Origin achieve his vision of millions of people living and working in space? Would his philanthropic billions genuinely improve human outcomes, or merely place his name on buildings? "The stock price is just a number," he had often told his team. "What matters is whether we've made life better for customers." As he turned back toward the house, Jeff's phone buzzed with a final message for the day. A reminder about tomorrow's meeting with a potential Earth Fund grant recipient developing carbon capture technology. The empire continued its expansion, one decision, one system, one mechanism at a time. For Jeffrey Preston Bezos, even with a net worth fluctuating around $180 billion, it was still, and would always be, day one.